In this video, I'm going to teach you exactly how to create your own appointment scheduling application, just like Zocdoc, without writing a single line of code using a tool called Bubble. Now, before I say another word, let's dive in and take a quick preview of what we're going to be building today. Over in a preview of my application here, we've opened up our home page of Zocdoc, and as you'll see, we'll be able to search for doctors by their specialties, or if we wanted to perform our own custom search, we could do that. So let's say we're searching for dentists within San Francisco, and I want to also book this appointment for tomorrow. I'm then going to perform this search. It's going to send us through to our search results page. And then on this page, we're going to see a list of all of the relevant doctors that fit this search. So these are all of my dentists in San Francisco. Now on this page, I can see some basic information about each dentist. So things like their average star rating and the total number of reviews that they've received. But if I scroll on down, I can also see a long list of all of the available appointment slots that they have. Now, one thing I should also point out is that it goes without saying, within our app today, every single page is going to be fully responsive across both desktop and mobile devices. So if I was to reduce the width of my browser here, as you'll see, this page is going to be fully responsive regardless. Now, if we also wanted to learn more about each doctor, what I could do is select on their profile, and it's going to send us through to their dedicated profile page, where once again, I can view more information about them. I can see a list of all of their reviews that they've received. And if I really wanted, once again, I could book an appointment on whatever date I would like. So let's say I changed my mind and I want to book an appointment for this date here. I'm then going to select on this available time slot. I will confirm my booking. It will then create that booking in our database. It's going to send me an email to confirm my booking. And then it's also going to redirect me through to a page where I can see a list of all of my upcoming appointments, as well as a list of all of my past appointments. Now for all of my past appointments, I can also leave a review for each doctor. And that review would of course be displayed on their profile page. Now, if I quickly just switch things up and log in as a doctor within my app, what you'll see is that we have the ability to manage the information stored within our clinic. So we can update the name of the clinic, the address, or we can update the time slots in which we're available. So if I want to make my 9:30 time slot available here, I can tick that, and now our patients will be able to book a time at that particular slot. I've also created a dedicated dashboard page where each doctor can see a list of all of their upcoming appointments. And if they ever want to mark that they're unavailable on a particular date, they can easily do this as well. So once I select on this, it's going to make sure that no one can book an appointment for this doctor on that date. Now look, this is just a small sample of all of the features that power our Zocdoc clone. There's still so much happening behind the scenes that I can't wait to show you in more detail. If you're watching this video, I'm going to take a wild guess and say that you're a non-technical founder looking to build your own app or startup. After all, I am that person as well, which is why I learned to use Bubble and why I created this channel. Now, if you're looking to bring your app idea to life, I know firsthand just how complicated it can be to either find a technical co-founder or even realize that you need to pay a small fortune for someone else to build it for you.
No! God, please, no! No!
Now look, if both of those options seem less than ideal, which I know they are, Bubble's going to be your new best friend when it comes to your startup journey. Bubble is what's known as a no-code tool, which in simple terms just means that it allows you to build fully functional apps without having to touch or write a single line of code. To this day, I still don't know how to code, yet I've been able to create a whole suite of apps using their powerful tool. When it comes to no-code tools, Bubble truly is superior. Not only do you have the ability to create your own custom database, but you can design every pixel of your application exactly how you want it. You can also stitch your app together and make it functional using visual workflows. And finally, you can integrate with third-party tools and services. Now, each one of these things alone would be a standalone no-code product. So it truly just blows my mind that Bubble includes all of this in one single tool.
Damn!
Now look, by this point, I've already rambled on for long enough. There truly is just so much that I need to cover within this course today. So let's grab our Bubble editor and we can dive right into it. Within our tutorial today, the very first thing that I wanted to cover wasn't actually a user-facing feature, but instead, I just wanted to take the time to set up and configure our own custom database, so that way we can power the rest of our Zocdoc platform. Now look, when it comes to setting up your own custom database in Bubble, this can be quite overwhelming, particularly if you are brand new to using Bubble in general. But look, it is your boy's job here today to make sure you completely understand absolutely everything I'm about to talk about. So that's why I'm going to explain everything you need to know in as much detail as I can. And to help along the way, what I've also done is I've created this checklist of items that we're going to add into our database, as well as a long list of all of the features that we're going to build out within our Zocdoc clone today. And look, as you can see, this thing stretches on for miles. There's so much that I need to cover. Now, this checklist has been created in a tool called Notion. And what I love about Notion is that you can just create a document and you can tick items off as you add them into Bubble. So it's just going to help me keep track of where I am throughout my build. And of course, I'll be sure to include a link to this checklist in the description of this video, so that way you can make a duplicate version yourself and follow along with me. But look, when it comes to creating our custom database, you'll see that I've listed out everything at the top section of our page here. And when you're getting started with Bubble, there's two core principles you really need to understand when it comes to creating your own database. And that is the difference between data types as well as data fields. So what on earth are these two things? When you think about a database, the purpose of it is to store information that your users create inside of your application. So every single time a user creates something in your app, we're going to store and log that in a database. And of course, that means that we can later on retrieve that information and display it to any user at any given point in time. And the way in which Bubble does this is by referring to information as both a data type or a data field. So what you'll notice here is that above all of my checklist items, I have a heading. And these headings are known as my data types. So a data type is an overall entity, or the way I like to think of it, it is something that your users are going to create inside of your application. So any single time a user needs to create something, that should be a data type. So before I even open up Bubble, I like to sit down and create a checklist of everything that I think my users will need to create inside of my unique application. And so let's quickly just run through this experiment now. If I was to think about a Zocdoc clone, the first thing that comes to mind is that a user is going to need to create an account. So that is why we have this data field known as a user, because every single time they sign up to our application, they're going to create a new entry, which is their profile in our database. Then from here, if someone would like to list their clinic within our application, they would need to create a new clinic. And if I scroll on down, if a doctor with a clinic would like to list their availability, they're going to create a new time slot. And as we go down, you'll see we have a data type for an appointment, because every single time someone books an appointment, they're going to create a new appointment entry in our database. And then finally, we have this review data type, because once someone has gone to an appointment, they could leave a review for a doctor or a clinic. So that then means they're going to create a new review. Now, inside of each data type, we have what's known as our data fields. And this is all of the information that you're going to see and store within each entry. So every single time someone registers a user account, we're going to need to store some information about that person. And so that could be things like the user's name, their profile photo, their profile type, and the list just goes on. And if we were to open up our Bubble editor now and select our data tab, what you'll notice is that this is broken down into two separate sections of the page. So on the left-hand side of the page here, you'll see we have the option to add in all of our data types. Then when you click on a data type, on the right-hand section of our page, it displays all of our data fields. And something you might also notice is that by default, we have this user data type pre-created for us inside of Bubble. And the reason for that is because Bubble just knows that in order for someone to actually use your application, they're going to need to register an account. So that's why your user data type will come baked in by default. Now, inside of your user data type, you're automatically going to have some data fields. So whenever someone registers an account in your app using Bubble, they're going to need to store an email and a password. So you'll see here that the email data field is already created for us. Now, there is also a password field, but you just won't be able to see that in plain text just for security reasons. But I just wanted to take the time to explain the difference between data types and data fields, because this truly is the crux of our database. And so when it comes to actually setting up our database, the first thing I'd like to do is add in all of my different data types. And the reason why I personally add in all of my data types first is because that, as you'll see in my Notion checklist, some of our data fields actually link to different data types. And I'll explain more about that when we get there in a moment. But when it comes to our data types, we have our user data type, which is already added in. But the next data type will be our clinic. So I'm just going to jump into Bubble. I'll type that in. Then we can jump back into Notion, scroll on down. And my next data type is a time slot. So I'm going to jump back into Bubble, select in this field where I can create a new data type. And I'm going to call this a time slot. Then there was another data type called our appointment. And then finally, there was one called our review. And something else I should also just point out is that when it comes to naming your data types, you should almost in every use case never use a plural. And so that means you should never add the letter S at the end of any of the data type names. So for example, when it comes to our review data type, although the users of our app are going to create multiple reviews throughout the course of their lifetime, at any given point in time, they're only going to be able to create one review at once. So whenever they create something, they're creating a singular review, not reviews with a plural. And so that's why you'll see me almost never use a plural when it comes to the name of my data types. And I just wanted to point this out because if you do use a plural, things might start to get a little bit confusing when you need to reference your data types later on. But look, thankfully, this is all of the data types we'll need to add into our database. Now, before we can add in our data fields, just when you thought you were starting to get the hang of things, I'm going to throw another curveball into the mix. Now, trust me, I wouldn't do this if it wasn't necessary. The last thing I hate having to deal with is extra complexity, but I assure you, this is going to be worth your time. So when it comes to data types, as I mentioned, these are all things that your users of your app are going to create. But what about information you want to store in your app that only you as the sole admin or owner of your app can create? So this is information you might want to display to your users, but you don't want them to create it. You want to be the only person who can create and show that. And so what's a good example of this? If I quickly just jump back into my Notion checklist and scroll on down here, you'll see I have what's known as a list of specialties. And so by specialties, I essentially just mean the different types of categories that a doctor can list on their profile. So are they a dermatologist? Are they a dentist? Are they an eye doctor? And so on. Now, instead of allowing our doctors to actually create a new specialty every single time they want to select a specialty for their profile, what we're going to do is be the only people who can create a list of specialties that they can then choose from. And so why would we want to do that? First of all, there's no guaranteeing that every single time a user adds in a specialty that they're going to spell it correctly. Trust me, this is something you're going to find out sooner rather than later, but your users in your app will be prone to making mistakes. People aren't perfect. And the other thing as well is that if users were to create their own specialties, there's no guaranteeing that they wouldn't create duplicate entries of specialties that already exist. And so what I'd like to do as the admin of our application today is create a list of specialties that our doctors need to choose from. So we are the people who are going to be creating this data in our database. So this data should actually already exist and our doctors will just reference that existing information. And so how can we add all of this existing information into our database? Thankfully, there is a feature in Bubble known as option sets. And so this is going to be that curveball that I throw at you. Not only do we need to understand what data types are, but we also need to wrap our head around data fields. And now we need to understand this new concept known as option sets. And so option sets are exactly what I've just explained. They're a piece of existing information in your database that only you as the admin can create. And when it comes to option sets, I'll only ever use these when I have things like different categories, so that way users can only select from the options that I have pre-created for them. Now, if we were to jump back into our Bubble editor, and if we have our data tab open, you'll notice that across the top menu, we have this option here known as option sets. Now, I'm just going to skip this tutorial, but if you would like an additional guide to learn what option sets are, I'd recommend checking out this video. Trust me, my feelings won't be hurt. But I'm just going to skip this tutorial here. And what you'll notice is that the process of creating option sets kind of looks the same as creating a data type. So on the left-hand side here, we have the ability to create the name of it. And then soon in a moment on the right-hand side, you'll see that we can actually store the information inside of it. And so if I was to just jump back to my Notion checklist, you'll see I have 3 different types of option sets I want to create today. So the first thing is our profile type. And the reason why I've created this is because when someone registers an account, I want them to only choose from 2 different types of account types. There's going to be the patient and there's going to be a doctor. I don't want them to choose any other profile type Because if it was up to the user to create their own profile type, they'd probably make themselves a master admin of this application. And look, while our users are important, they're not that detrimental to our app. We should be the only one who determines what type of profile they could be. And so that's why for my first option set list, I'm going to call this the profile type. So if I jump into Bubble, I'm going to type in the words profile type. Then over here, I'm actually going to jump ahead and I'm going to add in all of the options here. And the reason why this looks like we're creating a data type is essentially because we are. When it comes to our data types, this is all information that users will be able to add into our application later on in the future. So of course, users will be able to create reviews at any point in time in the future. But right now, there are no reviews in our database. With option sets, however, we are essentially creating and storing that information in our app right now. And that information probably won't change unless we add anything else to it. So it's like the reverse of a data type. So for the options here, I'm just going to type in two options. There's the patient as well as the doctor. And this is all I need to add for now. So when a user registers an account, they can either be one of these two options and nothing else. I'm then going to jump back into Notion. I can tick off that I've finished adding in these option sets. And now I can build out my list of specialties. So as I mentioned before, these are like my categories for a doctor's profile. So this will just determine what type of doctor they are. And so I'm going to jump into Bubble. I'll type in the word specialties here. I'll create this as a new option set list, and then I'll just need to add across all of these different options. So I'm just going to copy these. I'll add in the dermatologist. There was the dentist. And look, I apologize, this is going to be boring, but I'm just going to copy and paste these options across. So I'd recommend that you pause this tutorial and do that now as well. One thing I should just point out though while I'm doing this is that I've only added a small list of options here for the sake of our tutorial today. Whereas if you really wanted, you could go ahead and add in as many different options as you would like here. But I don't want to bore you having to sit here for half an hour while I add in a long list of options. So I'm just going to keep it as this short list here. Now that's everything I'll need to add from my specialties list. So I'm going to jump back into Notion, highlight all of these and tick those off. And the very last thing I need to build out is the time option set. And the purpose of this option set list is that whenever a doctor creates an account and they go to select what time slots they're going to be available on, I want them to choose from the times formatted exactly how I set them as. So for instance, if we were to give our doctors the control of creating the time slots that they were available, there's no telling if they'll spell it exactly the way I have here. So you can see here my time slot is 9 a.m. and there's a space between these two words. So there's no telling if they would, let's say, add in no space here, or if they would write this in 24-hour time, or they might even put a 0 in front of the 9. Whereas if I create this as an option set list, I can ensure that there is consistency across all of the time slots in my app. So what I'm going to do is jump back into Bubble here. I'm going to create a new option set called time. And now I'm going to add each of these options in. So first of all, there was my 9 a.m. time slot. Then I'm going to set a 9:30 a.m. time slot. And so I'm just going to set these in half an hour increments. But by all means, you can set these to whatever standard you would like. I'm then going to add in the 10 a.m. time slot, the 10:30 a.m. time slot. And look, I'm just going to quickly jump ahead and add in the rest of these options for now. And look, once again, when it comes to our tutorial today, I'm going to keep these as a simplified list. I'm not going to go too crazy, so I'm just going to cap this out at 2 p.m. But if you really wanted, you could make this list as long as you would like. What we're going to then do though is just jump back into our Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished adding in all of these final option sets. And now the reason why I added in all of my option sets before I built out any of my data fields here is because, as you might notice, some of our data fields here are going to link back to our option sets. So for instance, every single time a user creates an account, we're going to need to store a profile type on that account. So are they a patient or are they a doctor? And so that's why I've waited to build out all of our data fields, because we just need to make sure we can link all of the relevant information together before we actually create anything in our database. But what I'd now love to focus on is building out all of these data fields. And the first list we'll focus on is the data fields under our user data type. So every single time someone registers an account within our app, they're going to need to store some information about themselves. So if we open up our user data type, we're going to create a brand new data field here, and we're going to call this the name field. So obviously, whenever someone creates an account, I'd like to store their name. Now, after naming this field, you'll also see this drop down, which allows us to select what type of data we're going to store in this field. And you'll see down the bottom here, we can reference, is this going to be text? Is it going to be a number, a date, a file, an image, even an address, and so on. And look, thankfully for this field, it's going to be fairly straightforward. I'd just like this data field to store some text because we're going to write someone's name out in it. For the next field, I'm going to reference someone's profile photo. And for this field type, if I scroll on down, we're going to reference an image because I'd like to obviously store a picture within this field. Now, one thing you might just notice is that when it comes to the spelling of my data field here, when it comes to my data fields, if it's broken down into 2 words, I personally just like to add a dash. And the reason for that is because when it comes to my data types, if I have 2 separate words, I like to leave a space. Whereas with my data fields, if I leave a dash, I can easily tell the difference between the 2. And look, when you start to reference data types and fields later on in Bubble, it's just the small things like this that are going to help make your whole building process much more intuitive and easy. So that's why I've added a dash here. I'm then going to choose to create this field. And then for the next field, this was going to be called the profile type. And now when it comes to the type of data we're going to be storing in this field, I'd actually like to link this to my option set here. So under our option sets, you can see we can easily just reference our profile type option set. And if you remember, we had 2 options in that list. So someone could be a patient or they could be a doctor. I'm going to choose to create this field here. And what I'm going to actually do is set a default value on this field. And I'm going to set this to be a patient. And so what that now means is that everyone who registers for my app is by default going to be a patient, not a doctor. I'm only going to allow people to update their profile type when they actually choose to upgrade their account to become a doctor later on. But for the time being, everyone will be a patient by default. The other thing I should point out is that when it comes to our profile photo, what I'd also like to do is add a default value here. So if I really wanted, I could upload an image and that would be the standard profile photo for any user in our app. Now, the reason why I might like to upload a default image here is because if someone creates an account and they don't upload their own custom profile photo, and if we then go on to reference that profile photo, it will just show nothing. Whereas at the bare minimum, what I'd like to do is just display perhaps like a default avatar image, just so that way there's no blank spaces in my app. Now, thankfully, what I've done for our tutorial today is I've taken the time to upload a series of images to a Google Drive here that you can reference. So this drive will contain all of the images I'm going to use, so that way you can easily follow along with me. And what you'll notice is that I've uploaded this default profile photo image here. So once you've downloaded this, which of course I'll be sure to include a link to this drive in the description of this video, what you can then do is just choose to upload that exact image under the default value for our profile photo here. So I'm just going to jump ahead and do that myself now. Then after uploading my profile image, what I'm going to do is create the next field. And this is just going to be the sex of the patient. Now for this field type, I'm just going to set this to be a text option. But if you really wanted, you could make this an option set list. But look, today I'm not going to try and overcomplicate things. I'm just going to leave this as a text field. Now look, this information might be important for a platform where you're referring people to doctors, just because sometimes patients might like to choose a doctor that matches the same sex as them. So that's why I'm storing this field here. I'm going to choose to create this for now, but the very last data field I'd like to create is going to be called the owned clinic. Now, as I mentioned before, when a user signs up to our application, they will be a patient by default. However, there might be a point in time where they want to upgrade to become a doctor and list their clinic on our platform. And so when they do that, what I'd like to do is create a link to that clinic that they then own. So for this field type, I'm going to link this to our clinic data type. And this is where you'll really start to see the power of Bubble come to life. In our clinic data type, we're going to store the information for that entire clinic. So things like its address, its name, its website, its phone number, and so on. And so what we've now done is we've created a relationship between our user data type and our clinic data type. So what we've said is that a user can now own a clinic. And if at any point in time we wanted to display the information of the clinic that a user owns, we can now easily do that. But look, for now, that's everything we need to cover within our user data type. So we can jump back to our Notion checklist. And we can check off that we've finished adding in all of those data fields. So the next list of data fields will be under our clinic. So as I just mentioned, for every clinic that a doctor creates, we're going to want to store some information for that as well. So if we jump back into our bubble editor, open up our clinic data type, the very first field I'm going to create is the name of the clinic. And so for our field type, similar to the name of our user, I'm going to set this to be text. I'll then choose to create that. Then for this clinic, I'd also like to store a description. So this is going to be a little bit of information about this clinic. And for this field type, it's once again just going to be a plain text field. It's super straightforward. Then for our next field, I'm just going to type in the word address. So for this clinic, I'd like to store the physical address of it. And for this field type, if we scroll right down to the bottom, we're going to link this as a geographic address, which means it's going to link and integrate with Google Maps. So that way we can pull, display, and store real-world addresses directly inside of our Bubble app. And I'm going to show you how we can easily do that later on. But for now, we're just going to create this field here. Now, for every clinic that's created in our database, I'd also like to create a link back to a specific doctor that works or owns this clinic. So this is going to be similar to the field which was known as the owned clinic within our user data type. Only this time, I'm going to create a relationship back the other way. So for our clinic here, I'm going to create a new field, and I'm going to call this the doctor field. And this field type will be linked to our user data type, because a user can be a doctor, and I want to store who the doctor is that works at this clinic. So I'm going to choose to create that. Then for the remaining fields, we're just going to need to store some basic information about the clinic. So things like the website URL as well as the phone number. So I'm just going to type in the word website. For this field type, it's going to be a plain text field. I'll create that. Then, as I mentioned, there was the phone number of this clinic. And for this field type, once again, I'm going to select that this should be text. I don't need this to be a number. The only case in which you'd use a number is if you ever want to perform a calculation on some numeric values. If you're just storing a number that you need to just display as text, you can just store that as text. So I'll choose to create that there. Then for each clinic, I'd also like to store the categories or the specialties that they service. So is this clinic a dental clinic? Is it a dermatologist? And if you remember, we had stored all of these specialties within our option set list here. So we just need to create a link between our clinic data type and our option sets list here. So in our data types, we're going to create a new field, and this will be called specialties. Now for this field type, as I mentioned, we're going to create a link to our specialties option set. And now because in my Zocdoc clone, I'm going to allow each clinic to have more than one specialty, I'm going to tick this option here to make this a list with multiple entries, which now means that this field is a list of specialties. So a clinic can store multiple specialties under this one field. And finally, there's one last data field I'll need to store, and that is just going to be the unavailable dates for this clinic. So if a doctor at a clinic ever needs to take some time off, or if they're sick in general, what I'd like them to do is be able to mark a date as unavailable. So that way no one can book appointments on this date. And so for this field type, I'm going to set this as a date. And because a doctor can list more than one unavailable date, I will select that this should be a list with multiple entries as well. I'll then choose to create this here. Then we can jump back into our Notion checklist, tick all of these data fields off, and work our way down to our time slot data type. Now, when it comes to this data type here, as I'd mentioned in the past, when a clinic or a doctor creates their actual clinic on our application, they should be able to select what time slots they would like to service patients at. And every single time they create a time slot, I'm going to obviously need to store this in my database. And then inside of each time slot, I'm going to need to store some information about what the time itself is. We'll also store a session number, as well as recognize which clinic this available time slot belongs to. So if we jump into our bubble editor, I'm going to open up our time slot data type. And the very first field I'd like to create is going to be called the time. And for this field type, I'd like to link this to our option set, which was known as time. So in our option sets list, this is where we were storing all the actual times written out. So 9 a.m., 9:30, and so on. So every single time someone actually creates a time slot, we're going to store whatever time they select from our menu. I'm also then just going to recognize what the session number will be for this time slot. And the reason why I'm doing this is so that way if I ever need to display a list of all of my times, I can display them in the correct order. So perhaps I should just quickly close this and jump back to my option set list. Later on, what we're going to do is create a way to recognize that 9 a.m. is session number 1, 9:30 is session number 2, 10 a.m. is session number 3, and so on. So that way, whenever I need to display a list of times, I can easily have them being displayed in chronological order. And so for each time slot, what I'm going to do is reference what the session number is. And if I set this field type to be a number, what Bubble will allow me to do is to actually sort and filter those by the chronological order. So that's why I'm creating this field here. And look, to be honest, we're only going to use that once or twice throughout our app, but it is something we'll still need to create. Then finally, within the very last data field for our time slot, I'd just like to link this time slot to a clinic. So that way, when you open up a clinic's page, you can see a list of all of the time slots that they have created that they're available for. So I'm going to create a new field here, and I'm going to call this the original clinic. So for short, I'm just going to abbreviate this to OG clinic. And for this field type, I'm going to link this to our clinic. I'll then choose to create that. Then we can jump back into Notion, tick each of these items off, and I can see there's 2 more data types we need to build out. So under our appointment here, we're now going to store some information each time an appointment is scheduled within our app. So if we jump into Bubble, we'll open up our appointment data type. And the first thing I want to store for each appointment is the clinic in which this appointment was booked at. So I'm going to create a new field here. And for this field, I'm going to call this the clinic. And as you probably guessed, we're going to link this to our clinic data type. I can then choose to create this. Then obviously, if we're booking an appointment at a clinic, I also need to reference who the patient is for this appointment. So I'm going to create a new field and call this the patient. And I can see I just have a few typos there. I'll fix that. Now for this field type, I'm going to link this to our user data type because the patient will be a user in our app who has booked that appointment. So I'm going to choose to create this here. Then from here, I'd like to create another field, which is going to be called the time slot for this appointment. So I'd like to know at what time this appointment is going to occur. So is it 9 a.m., 9:30, 10:30, and so on. So for this field type, I'm actually going to link this to my time slot data type. And if you remember, our time slot contained a whole lot of information. So the time slot determined what the original clinic was, the session number, as well as the actual time itself. So that's why I'm creating this link here. And then finally, for each appointment, I obviously know the time in which this is going to take place, but I'd like to also store the date in which this is going to take place. So I'm going to create another field here called the date, and I'll set this field type to be a date, which is an option that Bubble pre-provides for us. So I'm going to choose to create that there, and that is all of the data fields we need to build out under our appointment data type. So we're going to jump back into Notion, check all of those off, and the very last list of data fields we need to build out is under our review data type. So every single time someone creates a new review in our database, I'd like to store some information. And the very first bit of information I want to store is just going to be the original clinic that this review was published against. So I'm just going to create a field here once again called the OG clinic, and I'm going to set this field type to once again be linked to my clinic data type. So that way, if I ever create a page that displays the information of a clinic, I can easily then reference all of the reviews published for that clinic. So I'm going to choose to create that there. Then for a review, I'd also like to store a rating. So this is going to be a 1 to 5 star rating. Now for this field type, I do want to store this as a number because later on, I'm going to perform some calculations on all of my reviews. So that way I can display some information like the average star rating for each clinic, as well as perform a count on how many ratings have been submitted. So I'm going to choose to create this field here. And then finally for each review, I'd also like to create a field known as the comment. So this is just going to be the text comment that someone adds on the review. So as I've just mentioned, this field type will be a plain text field. Then we can choose to create that. We can jump back into our Notion checklist and we can tick off that we've finished adding in all of those data fields. And just like that, that is all of the data fields, data types, and option sets that we need to build out within our application today. Now, I know that if you're brand new to Bubble, this was quite a lot to take in. So if you found yourself getting confused at any point in time, please don't stress, Particularly if this is the very first app you've ever tried to build in Bubble, I'd recommend trying to rewind this tutorial and rewatch a few of these key concepts back over. Just because I remember when I first got started with Bubble, it took me a while to get my head around how you could actually create a database from scratch. Look, one additional thing I do just want to point out is if I jump back into my Bubble editor, you may have noticed that within my data types tab, our user data type had this text here, just indicating that there was a privacy rule added to this by default. Now, if I click on this, it's going to take us through to our privacy tab, and it's going to show us what this privacy rule actually means. Now, if I was to break this down into simple terms, it's just a default setting that Bubble applies to your user data type, where users are the only people who can view any information that they publish within our app. So say for instance, if you signed up to my app as a doctor and you created a clinic, as this privacy rule stands, you would be the only person who could view that clinic. I wouldn't be able to see it. Now that is not the experience we want to create today. While this privacy rule is great for things like internal tools, we're actually creating a marketplace of some kind. So we want users to be able to interact and see all of the information that other users create. So what we're going to do is click this little trash can icon and delete this privacy setting. And now what you'll see is that our user data type will be publicly visible, just like all of our additional data types there. And that is literally everything that I wanted to cover within this section of our course. I feel like I've already bombarded you with so much information, but after building this out, we can finally get to the cool part of our build, and that is designing things like the homepage of our Zocdoc clone. Now that we've finished setting up our database, we can move on down to the list of features I have set out for us in our checklist today. And as you'll see, there is quite a few features that I want to work within as we create our Zocdoc clone. But the very first thing I want to take the time to build out is going to be the homepage of the product itself. And so if you're familiar with Zocdoc, there's not too much on this homepage. It's primarily used just to start the search experience where a user can actually search for a specific doctor that they want to visit. And so if I was to go and open up the real world Zocdoc product, what you'd see on this homepage is that there's quite a few things happening. At the very top of this page, we have this navigation menu, which we are going to build out in our clone in a moment. But below this, we have a heading, we have a couple of different search fields. And then if we were to scroll on down, you can see that we also have these search categories. So these are the primary features that I'm interested in building out on our homepage. And look, in comparison to some of the other products I built out in Bubble, this one is slightly easier. So if we were to jump over into our Bubble editor here, we're going to open up our index page. So by default, whenever you create an app in Bubble, you have this index page. So this is going to be your home page. So every single time your application is opened, this is the page that's going to be displayed to a user. Now, before we can build out any of the elements that are going to actually sit on this page, we actually need to take care of some housekeeping. So if you were to double click anywhere on this page, it's going to open up what's known as your property editor. So inside of Bubble, this is your settings menu for anything on your page. And it just allows you to update and change any of the settings for any particular element. And the very first thing I'm interested in doing within my property editor is opening up my layout tab, because as you'll see, there's this option here known as the container layer. And when you're working with any page in Bubble, this is a setting you'll need to update before you can build out anything else on your page. So what on earth is the container layout? The container layout just determines in which order elements will be positioned on your page. So if I was going to add a series of elements onto my page, so let's say some things like some text, some images, some buttons, all of these elements are going to sit inside of the page itself. So my page is known as a container, because if you were to open that container up, it has all of my elements sitting inside of it. But if we were to also open up this drop-down menu, you'll see 4 different options that we can select from. And look, thankfully, when it comes to working inside a Bubble, I'll only ever choose 2 of these options, and that is the row and the column option. So what's the difference between the two? As I just mentioned before, the container layout will determine in which order elements are positioned on your page. So if you were to select the column option, it would position elements from top to bottom. So it would stack elements vertically. Whereas if you were to select the row option, it would stack elements from side to side, so horizontally. And perhaps the best way to illustrate this is just by showing you a quick example. So if I was to set the container layout to be a column, and if I was to just add 2 button elements onto my page, as you'll see, these 2 elements are now stacked on top of each other, so vertically down my page. Whereas if I was to select on my page again and open up my layout tab, and if I wanted to set the container layout to be a row, these two elements will now be stacked side by side. Now look, when it comes to the overall container layout of any page inside of Bubble, I will always use the column option. I'll never use the row option. And the reason for that is because when you think about it, most applications are built from the top down. So if I was to open up Zocdoc once again, although we do have some elements positioned horizontally across our page, when it comes to the actual overall structure of the page itself, everything is positioned from the top down. So at the very top here, we have our navigation menu. Below this, we have our hero search section. Below this, we then have our search categories. So all these different sections are stacked on top of each other. Now, of course, we do have some elements obviously stacked horizontally across our page. And of course, I am going to show you how we can build that out inside of Bubble in a moment. But let's just start with our overall container layout for the page. And we're going to set this to be a column. And you'll see that this is a setting I use time and time again when it comes to configuring my pages inside of Bubble today. I'm just going to delete these two buttons off here now, just because I don't need them. They were just for an example. But now from here, we can start to build out all of the elements we need to display on this page. And the very first section I just want to build out is this hero section here. So within this, I'm going to make a pretty bare bones version, and I'm just going to add some text as well as all of these different search fields. But as you can see, all of these elements here kind of sit within this section of our page at the top, which I just referred to as the hero section. And so when it comes to kind of grouping all of these elements into a particular section, we're going to leverage an element known as a group in Bubble, which as the name would suggest, just allows you to group a bunch of different elements together. So we could group our heading here with our search fields, and that would just create this nice section at the top of our page. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to jump over into Bubble here, and if we scroll on down, you're going to see this option known as the containers menu. And within this, you'll see a group element. So if I was to add this onto my page, it kind of just looks like a square on my page. But group elements within Bubble are incredibly powerful. Groups are kind of like small pages that sit within your overall page. And a big benefit to using groups is that because they are like small pages, they also have the container layout option. So for instance, if I wanted to position some elements horizontally across my page, so something like this search experience here where we have 3 different input fields sitting side by side, what you could do is add a group onto your page and set the container layout to be a row. And then what you'll find is that when you add elements into this group, these are going to be positioned side by side. And the reason they're not right now is because they just don't have enough space to sit within this group. But if I was to just jump over and stretch this group out here, what you'll see is that they are now being positioned horizontally. But look, I'm just going to quickly revert all of those settings and remove my buttons here because I want to explain how to configure everything from scratch. So if I double click on this group, the first thing I'm actually going to do is jump to my appearance tab, head on down to my styling here and detach the default style. And the reason for this is because similar to the real world Zocdoc product, I just want to give this group a background color, which is going to be this kind of cream color you see here. So if I jump into Bubble, I'm going to update the background style to be a flat color. And when it comes to the color of this group, I'm going to make it a light shade of yellow here, which if you'd like this color code, it's FFDEB. And now you can see it's easy to distinguish where our group sits on our page. From here, I'm then going to jump to my layout tab, and we're just going to need to take the time to quickly update the container layout for this group. And so inside of this group, we just need to determine in which order we're going to be stacking elements. So do we want them to be from top to bottom, or do we want it to be from side to side? And so if we quickly just open up Zocdoc again, what I can see is that inside of this group, if we were to just add this heading as well as all of these search fields, these are actually stacked on top of each other. Even though our search fields are stacked side by side, the actual overall structure is set as a column because elements are stacked vertically. So when it comes to this group, we're also going to update the container layout to be a column. Then from here, we're going to need to update the width settings of this group. So this will determine how much space this group takes across our page. And this is where you'll start to see how we can create a responsive experience inside of Bubble. So right now, this group has a fixed width of 280 pixels, which just means that it's always going to be this exact size, which is 280 pixels across our page. Now, if I was to unselect to make this element fixed width, what I'd like to do from here is set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. Now this is a setting you're going to see me use so many times throughout our tutorial today. In fact, by the end of our tutorial, I'm probably going to sound like a broken record, but in Bubble, this is how you create a truly responsive experience across any device size. So if the minimum width of this group is 0 pixels and the maximum width is infinite, this group can take up as little or as much space as it needs on my page, which means it's going to be fully responsive. So if I was to jump into my responsive tab here, what you'll see is that we can reduce or expand the width of our page to any size on any device type. So if I was to expand this page out, as you'll see, because the group has an infinite maximum width, it's going to expand all the way out. Whereas if I was to reduce the width of this page, because this group has a minimum width of 0, it's also going to collapse right down to the point of 0 pixels. So right now we have a fully responsive group on our page. So if we just jump to our UI builder, I'm just going to open up my property editor again. And look, we're going to come back and update the height settings for this group in a moment. If I was to set that to be 0 right now, because we don't have any elements inside this group, it's just going to collapse to nothing. So we just need to add all of our elements inside this group before we update this setting. And look, the very first element I'd like to add in is just going to be that text heading. So if we head to our visual elements, I'm going to grab a text element here. And to be honest, I'm just going to create a pretty simplified version of the Zocdoc heading you saw. I'm just going to have this say the words book, local, doctors, near you. Now, when it comes to this text, I'm also just going to quickly change the size of this so that way it looks like an actual heading. So if I scroll on down, I'm just going to detach the default style here, and I'm going to set the font size to be 48 pixels. And then I'll need to jump over to my layout tab so I can also make this text element fully responsive. So if I once again head to my width, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So once again, this text element can take up as little or as much space as it needs on my page. And within my responsive tab here, what you'll see is that as the page closes, my text is just going to collapse onto a new line. So once again, this is how we create that fully responsive experience in Bubble. But over in my UI builder, I'm also just going to quickly update the minimum height here. So by default in Bubble, you'll always have this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it. Now the content inside of this element is the actual text itself. So if I was to set the minimum height to be 0, it's just going to ensure that the actual text element, so the rectangle you see around our text, that it's just going to collapse below the text within it. And then finally, I'm also just going to add in some margins around this element so it doesn't touch the borders of my group. So I'm going to add in 50 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right there. And as you can see, the top section of our page is slowly starting to come together. Below this though, things might start to get a little bit more complicated because what I'd like to now do is build out this whole search bar experience. So within this search bar here, we have 3 different input fields as well as a button. And thankfully this is something we can recreate inside of Bubble. But of course what I should just point out is that all of these elements are positioned horizontally together across our page. So in order to place all of these elements side by side within our page, we're going to need to add yet another group inside of our existing group. And we're going to set that new group's container layout to be a row. So if we jump into Bubble here, I'm going to scroll on down to our containers and once again add another group inside of our existing group here. Now because we're adding a group within a group, things can start to get a little confusing if you don't create a way to distinguish between all of the different groups on your page. And so what I personally like to do while I'm actually working inside of my editor is if I jump to my appearance tab, I'm going to detach the default style of this group and I'm then going to set the background style to be a flat color. And if I set this color to be something like a light shade of red, I can easily see where this group actually sits on my page. Now, of course, when you actually go to preview or publish your application, you can always remove this background style here and it'll just take that color away. However, when I'm actually working inside of my editor, this is just something I like to do because in my opinion, it kind of just makes me feel like I'm building with Lego blocks. So if I've got all of these different colored groups on my page, I can actually see how the structure of my page is put together. And it just makes things a million times easier to understand inside of your own application. So for the time being, I'm just gonna leave the background style here as red. If I was to jump over to my layout tab, however, As I mentioned, I'm going to need to set the container layout of this group to be a row, because inside of this group, I want to stack elements horizontally across my page. While we're also in our layout tab, I'm going to take the time to update the width of this group. So if I was to once again unselect that this should be a fixed width, I'll set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So that way, similar to our previous group, this group is also now going to be fully responsive. Now, before I update any of the height and the margin settings, I'll take the time to add all of the different elements that we need inside of this group. And the very first element is just going to be a drop-down menu, which allows someone to select what type of specialty of a doctor they want to visit. So if I was to scroll on down to my input forms, I'm going to grab a drop-down menu here. And when it comes to a drop-down menu, you have a couple of different options as to how you can set this up. By default, it allows you to add in a list of static choices. So you could type in a long list of all of the different options you want. So I could say something like dentist, or even just general GP. And then when a user opens up this drop-down menu, these are the options that will be displayed. However, when it comes to our tutorial today, we're not going to be using a list of static choices, but instead, under our choices style, we're going to reference a list of dynamic choices. Now, what on earth does that mean? The word dynamic is something you're going to hear a lot inside of Bubble today, and it just means that it's going to be able to change and respond to any information that's stored inside of your application. And so a great example of that is if we were to open up our data tab here and open up our option sets menu. You might remember that we'd previously created this option set list known as the specialties. So these were all of the different kind of doctors that we were going to allow on our platform. So there's things like the dermatologist, the dentist, the ear, nose, and throat doctor. And look, because all of this information already exists in my database, we can dynamically pull that information out from our database and display it within this drop-down menu. So that's what Bubble means by the word dynamic. That information already exists, and we're just going to pull it from our database and display it, as opposed to manually writing all of the options as a static list. So if I was to jump into my design tab here, because I've selected the dynamic choices, what I then need to do is configure what type of dynamic information I'd like to display within this drop-down menu. And that of course is going to be under our option sets, and it's going to be the list of specialties that I just mentioned. Then from here, Bubble will just need to know of that list of specialties, which options do we want to display. And thankfully this is super straightforward. I want to display all of the options within that list. And then finally, we just need to configure the caption for each option. So the caption is the actual text that displays within this drop-down menu, and that's going to be the option set, its display text. So the display text was the name of each option. So was it a dentist, was it an eye doctor, and so on. And so if I was to run a quick preview of my application at this point, what you'll see is that when I open up this drop-down menu, it's now allowing us to select an option from the list of option set specialties we had already configured. What I would like to do though is just update this text that's displayed inside of this drop-down menu. So I'm just going to close my preview here, and within our drop-down menu, you can update what's known as the placeholder text. So this is the text that's just going to sit inside of this drop-down menu until someone actually selects an option. And for this text, I'm just going to have this display the words condition, comma, procedure, comma, doctor, ... And look, this is the exact same text as the real-world Zocdoc app. So you can see here it says condition, procedure, doctor. Now, if I jump back into my Bubble editor once again, what I'm also going to do is update the name of this dropdown. So that way, internally, I can easily reference this dropdown menu and know what this element is called. So if I was to select at the very top of my property editor, this is actually the name of this element. And what I'm going to do is update this to be called dropdown specialty. And now I know that if I ever need to reference this particular drop-down menu or one of the options that someone has selected within this drop-down menu, this is just going to be called our drop-down specialty. And you'll see today, whenever I work with input fields, I always take the time to update the name of them. And you'll see why I do that when we start to build out workflows later on. But finally, for this drop-down menu, I just need to now jump into my layout tab and of course update the width settings for this. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, but right now, as you'll notice, with the maximum width set as infinite, this drop-down menu is going to take up the entire width of our group. And look, that's not an experience I want to create. While I do still want this drop-down menu to be fully responsive, it doesn't need to take up this much space. I only really want it to take up a third of my page here. So what I could do to combat that is set a maximum width on this input field to be something like 500 pixels. Now look, there's no scientific reason why I selected 500. I just think that this is going to be more than enough space to display all of my options. And if you really wanted, you could tinker around with this and make it whatever dimension you'd like, but I'm just going to leave mine as 500 pixels today. Now, once we've configured the width of this drop-down menu, there's a few additional settings I just want to update, and the first one is going to be the vertical alignment. What I'm going to do is vertically align this in the center of my red group. So that way, if I do this for all of my input fields I add into this group, they're all going to be perfectly aligned in the center. For the height settings, I'm going to leave this as the default option. So this height is currently fixed at 48 pixels, which means that this drop-down menu will always be this exact height you see, no larger and no smaller. And look, to be honest, I'm quite happy with that. The only other thing I might like to do is just update the top and the bottom margin to be 5 pixels each. And the reason for that is because when I collapse this group, it's just going to make sure the borders of my drop-down menu don't touch the borders of my red group. Now look, that's all I'll need to configure for this drop-down. Beside this though, I'd like to add yet another input field. Only in this instance, that input field is going to be a search box, which just allows someone to select the target location in which they want to search for a doctor in. So if I go to my input forms, I'm going to scroll on down and I'm going to grab a search box. I'm going to add this into my red group. And of course, because the container layout of my red group is set as a row, this is now going to be positioned horizontally within my page. Now, the first thing I might do with my search box here is just update the name of this. This is going to be called search box location because, as I mentioned, this is where someone's going to select the target location for their doctor search. Now, the way a search box works inside a bubble is that by default, it pulls dynamic data from a source that you give it. So let's say you had a list of users in your application and you wanted to search for users by their name. A search box is the perfect input field for that. So as you start to type in someone's name, it's going to give you a long list of predicted search results based on the value you type into that field. However, search boxes also have another superpower inside a bubble, and that is you have this option to make them reference geographic places. So when you select this option, it's automatically going to integrate with Google Maps. So that way it can search and index real-world addresses directly from Maps itself. And now this enables people to type in something like a postcode, a state, or a country that they want to search within. So that way later on our search results page, we can display a list of doctors within their target region. While we're in our appearance tab, I'm also just going to quickly update the placeholder text here. I'm going to have this display the words city, state, zip code, ... And once again, that is the same text that's displayed within the real-world Zocdoc product. I'm now just going to jump over to my layout tab because once again, we're going to need to update the responsive settings of this particular input field. So the first thing I might do is just unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, but similar to our drop-down menu, I don't need the maximum width to be infinite because that's taking up too much space on my page. So what I'm going to do is actually set the maximum width to be 300 pixels. Because if we were to look at the real-world Zocdoc product, this input field doesn't actually take up too much space in our overall search menu. So I'm just going to keep it quite small for now. I'll also vertically align this in the center of my red group, so that way it sits perfectly in line with our existing drop-down menu. For the height, I'm going to keep this fixed at 48 pixels, but then I'll just need to replicate the same margins from our drop-down menu, which were 5 pixels of margin at the top and 5 pixels of margin on the bottom. And now from here, there is one last input field I'd like to add beside this. And within my version of our Zocdoc clone today, this is where I'm going to make a slight alteration to the real world product. Because what I'm going to do is add a date picker input field. So that way someone can actually select what date they want to book an appointment for. So if I was to scroll on down to my input forms, right at the bottom here, you're going to see a date time picker. I'm going to add that in. And the first thing I'll do for this input field is update its name. So I'm going to call this date time picker date. I'll then jump over to my appearance tab. And for this input type, we're going to leave this as a date. However, I just want to update the date format. Instead of displaying this option with just numerical values, I'm going to select this option here to have the written day, as well as the month and the year. And that's all I'll need to change within my appearance tab. I can then jump over to my layout tab, because similar to before, what I'm going to need to do is update the width settings here. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0. And when it comes to the maximum width of this input field, I'm going to set this to be 280 pixels. Now, once again, there's not really any scientific reason why I selected 280. I think that this is just more than enough space to add in all of the information that I need. But when it also comes to our height, I'm going to leave that fixed at 48 pixels. So that way it is the exact same height as our previous input fields. I'm also going to vertically align this in the center of my red group and add in a top margin of 5 pixels and a bottom margin of 5 pixels. And then finally, the very last element I'll need to add within our actual red group here is a button. So similar to the real world Zocdoc product, we have this yellow button here with a little search icon inside of it. Now, unfortunately in Bubble, there is actually a button visual element. However, inside of a button, you can't add an icon. But thankfully, there is a workaround that we can do today, and that is that we can create our own custom button from scratch. So in Bubble today, I've talked about the benefits of using group elements where you can set a container layout within them. So like our red group here, I've updated the container layout so we can position all of these elements side by side. However, there is another benefit to using groups, and that is within our Appearance tab, groups have the ability to trigger a workflow. And of course, the workflow is the visual programming we're going to create in Bubble in a moment. But this means that if anyone clicks on this group, we can trigger an action to occur. So what we're going to do today is actually build a custom button using a group element. So if I was to scroll on down to my containers menu and grab a group, I'm going to add this into my red group, and I'm just going to update the name of this to be called Group Search Button. Now, when it comes to this group, the first thing I'm going to do is detach the style of this, and I'm going to give it a flat background color. And for this color, I'm going to make it a shade of yellow. So if you'd like this color code, it's FEE5A. Now, while we're here, I'm also going to update the roundness of this group's borders to be 3. So that way it has some slightly curved edges. But then I'll jump over into my layout tab here and update the container layout. Now within this group, we're only going to add one element, and that's going to be an icon. So it doesn't really matter if you select a row or a column, because realistically, we're not going to be stacking elements. We're only adding one element within it. I'm personally going to select the column option, and then I'm just going to quickly move this group to the end of my red group. So if I select that this should be in the next position, it'll be the last element inside of my group there. Now, when it comes to the width and height of this group, I'm going to set the width here to be 48 pixels. And as you'll notice here, I've actually set the width here to be a fixed width, not a responsive width. And the reason for that is because I only ever want this group to be 48 pixels at any given point in time. No larger and no smaller. I'm going to then do the exact same thing for my height. I'm going to set this to be 48 pixels. Now, the reason why I've selected 48 is, of course, because the height of all of our input fields are also 48 pixels, and these are a fixed height. So that means that this group here is now a perfect square. It's 48 pixels by 48, and it matches the exact same height as our existing input fields. I'm then going to vertically align this in the center of my red group before I then add in 5 pixels of margin at the top and 5 pixels of margin at the bottom. And now inside of this group, we can add our icon element. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, I'm going to grab an icon. I'll add this into my yellow group, and I'm just going to add a search icon. So this little magnifying glass. Now for the color of this icon, I'm just going to make this a custom shade of brown here. If you'd like that color code, it's just all 3s. Then from here, I'm going to jump to my layout tab. And look, for this icon, I'm quite happy to leave it as 30 pixels by 30 pixels. I think it's the perfect size as is. However, I just want to make sure this icon is centered both horizontally and vertically inside of my yellow group. So for the horizontal alignment, I'm going to center that in my yellow group. I'm then going to select on the yellow group itself. And what you'll also notice is that within our yellow group, we have something known as the container alignment. Now, the container alignment just determines in which position we can align elements inside of our group. And because the container layout of our yellow group is a column, we can choose how we align elements vertically within this group. So if I wanted to align this in the center, it would put our icon perfectly in the center. If I wanted it at the bottom, it would vertically align it at the bottom. But as I mentioned, I want this to be in the center. So that way it creates a beautiful experience there. And now look, that is all of the elements I wanted to add inside of this red group. So what I'm going to do is select on the overall red group here. I'm going to open up my layout tab, and as you can see at this point in time, we still have all of this empty space above and below all of our input fields. So what I'm going to do is head to our minimum height, and I'm going to set that to be 0. And because by default we have this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around all of the elements that sit inside of that group. Then while we're in our layout tab here, I'm also just going to update the margins around this group. I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 100 pixels of margin at the bottom, 20 on the left, and then 20 on the right. And as you'll see, if I close my property editor, our search bar has come together quite nicely. Now, if we wanted to get super pedantic about how we're actually designing our search bar, what you might notice is that each individual input field has curved borders around every single edge. Now, while that looks good on the side here, when two elements touch, as you can see, there's this kind of point where they both curve in next to each other. Whereas in my personal preference, I'd like these to just have straight edges so that way they meet. Now, by all means, this isn't completely necessary, but if you really want to get super specific like I do, what we're going to do is just remove the curved edges from the borders where it touches two input fields. So if I start by selecting on my very first drop-down menu here, so my drop-down specialty, if I scroll on down within my appearance tab, you'll see that this drop-down menu has curved borders around its edges and the roundness is set to 5. So that's the roundness of every single edge within this input. But what we can do is select this option to define each border independently. And now, as you'll notice, each border has a roundness of 3. And now what I'm going to do is actually set the roundness of the top right and the bottom right to be 0. So if I scroll on down to, first of all, the top right, I'm going to set that to be 0. And then for the bottom right, I'll set that to also be 0. Then we can select on our next field. And for this field, we're going to do the exact same thing. So I'm going to select this option to define each border independently. However, in this instance, because this input field is sandwiched between two different input fields, it just should not have any curved edges at all. So what you could do is set each edge to be 0. Or to be honest, I've just realized is that we don't need to define these independently. What we could do is just set the roundness to be 0. So that way every single border is just straight. So if I click away, as you'll now see, everything is just flat. I'll then select on my very last input field. And look, this is going to be the exact same as well. Because not only is it positioned next to an input field, but beside that we also have our button, which I also want to be connected. So I could just update the roundness here to be 0. And then finally, if I select on my yellow button, this is where we're going to need to define each border independently. And I'm just going to want the top left and the bottom left to be 0, but the top right and the bottom right can then be 3. So I can see by default now the top left is 0, the top right should be 3, the bottom right should be 3, and the bottom left should be 0. Now if I click away, and if I just close my property editor, look, it doesn't make too much of a difference, but it's just a bit of a personal preference that I have. And the very last thing I want to do for this hero section is just double click on my yellow group, open up my layout tab, and I'm just going to now remove this minimum height, and I'm going to set this to be 0. And of course, because this default option is selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it's just going to make sure it collapses around all of the elements inside of it. But of course, you just need to remember that with our red group, we had a bottom margin of 100 pixels. So that's just going to continually push that yellow group down, so that way we have some space here. Now, thankfully, that is everything we need to build within our hero section. Look, it did take quite a bit of time to create this search bar here, but what I'd now like to do is move on down to the next section of our homepage. And if we look at the real world Zocdoc product, I'm just going to display a list of categories that someone can search for. So if someone was to select on the eye doctor category, what I'd like to do is redirect them through to a search results page later on. And of course, it's going to display a list of all of the eye doctors near their current location. So when it comes to this section of our page, I can see we have two separate elements we need to build out. First of all, there's this heading here, and then below that, there's this list of all of the categories, or I should say specialties. So what I'm going to do is jump over into Bubble. I'm going to grab a text element under our visual elements here, and I'm going to add this to our page. Now this is outside of our yellow group. So this is on the white section of our page here. And for this text, I'm just going to have this display the words top specialists. Now for this text, because this is going to be a heading, I'm also just going to scroll on down, detach the default style of this, and set the font size to be 32. I'm then also going to make this element fully responsive on my page. So of course that means I'll need to jump to my layout tab. I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leave the maximum width as infinite. So once again, this element is now fully responsive because it can take up as little or as much space as it needs on my page. I'll then do the exact same thing for the minimum height because I've got this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it. It's just going to collapse around all of the text there. And finally, while we're here, I'm just going to add in 50 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this text element doesn't touch the borders of my page, as well as the group that sits above it there. Now below this, the very last element we're going to need to build out on our page is, as I mentioned, a list of all of those specialties. So all of the categories that someone can search for. And look, inside a bubble, if you're ever displaying a list of items, you're going to need to use a specific element known as a repeating group. Now, a repeating group is going to be your new best friend inside a bubble. If I was to scroll on down to my containers menu, under our group, you're going to see this option to add in a repeating group. Now, as the name would suggest, a repeating group is a list of groups. So it kind of looks like a spreadsheet in the way that it has all of these different rows, and each one of these rows is a group. Now, the big benefit to using a repeating group in Bubble is that it can easily connect to your database and pull and display information that you need, particularly any information that's in a list. So a great example of when you'd use a repeating group is if you'd ever want to build out, let's say, a homepage feed. So in an example, let's say you're creating an Instagram clone and you want to build out the homepage of Instagram where you've got the feed of posts. If you were creating that, a repeating group is the exact element you would need. So you'd plug it into your database and you'd say, hey, show me all of the Instagram posts of people that I follow. And it would just display an infinite list of all of those pieces of content. And so in our example today for Zocdoc, what we're going to do is display a list of all of these specialties we've stored within our database. So once again, if you remember, if I open up my data tab, under our option sets, we've already created this list of specialties here. So what I want to do is display all of these options so that way when someone clicks on an option, we can send them through to a search results page and display all of the doctors that are relevant to this particular category. So within my design tab, when it comes to a repeating group though, there are quite a few configurations that you need to set up. And particularly if you are new to Bubble, repeating groups can be quite hard to wrap your head around. But of course, it's my job today to explain everything you need to know in as much detail as I can. So if I select on my repeating group and open up my appearance tab, the very first thing I'm going to need to do is give this repeating group a data source. And what that means is that I need to tell it which information to display from my database. So what list of items should it display within this list here? And so the first thing I'll need to do is reference the type of content. And as you'll now see, we can select from our option set list or even potentially all of our data types. So if you wanted to display a list of all of your users in your database, you could select user. If you wanted to display a list of all of the clinics, you could reference the clinic. But today, as I mentioned, I'm going to reference my option set list known as my specialties. Now for the data source, thankfully, this is going to be super straightforward. I just want to reference all of my specialties. So that is all of the options within our option set list. It truly couldn't get any simpler than that. What we're then going to need to do is scroll on down and update the number of rows and columns that this repeating group is going to display. So right now this is fixed at 4 rows and 1 column. So what this means is that of all of my specialties, it's only going to display the first 4 options because this is fixed at a number of rows of 4. Now that's not the experience I want to create today. Instead, I want to display every single specialty within that list. And of course, if I add more to that list, I want those to also be displayed. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows. And then I'm also going to unselect that this should be a fixed number of columns. And now what you'll see is that you have the ability to update the minimum height and width of each individual cell inside of our repeating group. But before we change that, what I'm going to do is just jump to my layout tab and quickly make this repeating group fully responsive. So if I was to unselect that this should be a fixed width, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So that way this repeating group can take up as little or as much space as it needs on my page. And now this will just give us a better understanding of all of these cells within our repeating group. So right now you can see all of these different squares. So each one of these would be one of the specialties within my database. And of course, if I only have, let's say, 8 options within my option set list, it's just going to display 8 cells. It's not going to continually show all of this empty grid. But as you can see right now, these cells are quite small. So what I'm going to do is double click on my repeating group, jump to my appearance tab, and I'm going to take the time to update the minimum height and the minimum width of each particular cell. Now, when it comes to these values, look, I've been using Bubble for years now, and I still find that the best way to find the exact size you need is just through trial and error. So I'm just going to say right now 100 pixels by 100 pixels is quite small. So I'm going to say let's give us 200 pixels by 200 pixels and we'll see how that goes. Later on, I'll probably need to come back and update this value if I need any additional space. But at these dimensions, this is going to give us 200 pixels by 200 pixels, which kind of looks like enough to work with. And look, now from here, what I'd like to do is add all of the elements I'm going to display inside of our repeating group. But before I do that, I need to jump over to my layout tab and update the container layout of each individual cell in our repeating group. So as I mentioned before, a repeating group is truly just a list of groups. So inside of each group, I need to determine the container layout. And look, thankfully, I'm just going to set this to be a column because I'm only going to be adding one element inside of this repeating group cell. And that's going to be another group. Because if I jump over into Zocdoc here, and if I look at the list of specialties, what I can see is we have our overall repeating group. Then inside of each cell, we have another group. And the background color of that group is the cream color you see. And then inside of this group, we have two elements stacked on top of each other. There's an image, and then there is the text. So the name of that specialty. So that means that if we jump over into our bubble editor, I'm now going to head to our containers menu and add a group inside of our repeating group. And the first thing I'll do for this group is just jump to my appearance tab, detach the style of this and update the background style to be a flat color. Now for the color, I'm going to use the same color code we'd used as the hero section of our page. So if you'd like that again, it's FFDEB. I'm then going to click away here and I'll jump to my layout tab. And when it comes to this group, as I mentioned before, I'm going to be stacking two elements in this vertically within our group. So that means that if I'm stacking elements vertically, the container layout should be a column. I'm then going to need to make this group fully responsive inside of our repeating group cell. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. And now what you'll see is that this group is going to fit perfectly inside of our repeating group cell. Now while I'm here, I'm also just going to scroll on down to my margins. And I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin around every single border. So that way we have some space between each cell in our repeating group. So these groups are no longer touching anymore. Now what I can notice is that first of all, my height is still quite large. These groups are quite narrow. And to fix that, I'm going to add in all of my elements first before I come back and update the height. But when it comes to the width here, I feel like I just need a few more pixels of width inside of each repeating group cell. Right now, all of these cells are still quite narrow. So in order to fix that, I'm going to select on my overall repeating group, open up my appearance tab, and remember before when I mentioned that the minimum width and the minimum height of each cell would just be a matter of trial and error. This is exactly what I meant. So right now the minimum width is 200 pixels. So what I might do is just set this to be 220 pixels. And look, to be honest, that kind of looks more in line with what I envisioned. And so that's what I mean by trial and error. We're just going to continually make a few minor tweaks here and there until we get the perfect settings. And so inside of this group, I'm now going to display the information about each specialty. So I'm going to display an image for it as well as the title of it. And if you remember, in our data tab under our option sets list, right now the only information we're storing for each specialty is the name of it. So if we were to look at Zocdoc, we've taken care of the text element, but what we also need to store is an image for each specialty. So how can we do that? Thankfully, inside of our option sets, I haven't actually touched base on this yet, but you have the option to actually store additional information known as an attribute. So under your option sets, you'll notice here that we have an attribute, which is by default the display text. So that's the actual name of each option. So as you can see here, it is a built-in attribute that's added by default. But what we could also do is create an additional attribute known as the image or the icon for each specialty. And if we were to upload those ourselves right now, we can then display those within each cell of our repeating group. So what we're going to do is create a new attribute here, and I'm going to call this attribute the image for each specialty. And for this attribute type, it kind of looks like we're creating a data field under our option set. And that's because we essentially are. We're creating a way to store some additional information about each of the options in this list. Now, for this attribute type, I'm going to have this be an image. I'll choose to create this. And then if I was to select the option to modify each attribute, not only can we modify the name, but you'll also see the ability to upload an image. And look, at this point, I know exactly what you're thinking. Lachlan, I don't have any images to upload. Well, your boy here has gone one step further and I've created a list of images that we're going to use for our tutorial today. So if I just open up this Google Drive folder here, I've created a series of icons for all of our option sets, as well as added in some additional images that you'll need throughout our tutorial. So what I'm going to do is add a link to the description of this video and you can download all of these images here. And as you'll see, we have all of our icons for each of these specialties. So what I'm going to do is take the time to upload these from my local device. So I'm going to select to upload my image. And once that's uploaded, I'm going to choose to save this. I can then modify the attribute for my dentist category. I'll of course upload my image. I'll then save that. We'll do the same thing for our ear, nose, and throat doctor. I'll upload my image once again. Once again, I'm going to then save that. And look, I'm not going to bore you with having to watch me do it for the final 3 categories, but what I'd recommend you do is just pause the tutorial here and upload all of the additional images. Then once we've taken the time to add our image attribute, we can jump over to our design tab and we can now display that image within this cream group. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, we're going to grab an image here. So this image sits inside of our group, which of course sits inside of our repeating group. And within this image, I'd like to display the attribute that we've just uploaded for our option set list. But if I was to insert dynamic data, so once again, you're going to see that word dynamic here. And what that just means is that we're going to pull existing data from our database and display it to our end users. What I'd like to do is reference the option set within this cell of our repeating group and then display its image attribute. But if I was to look in this list right now, I don't have the option to actually reference the option set list. And the reason for that is because although this image technically looks like it sits inside of our repeating group, it doesn't. It sits inside of our group, which then sits inside of our repeating group. So if I was to just quickly remove this image here and select on my cream group, so this is just group D. Perhaps I could even update the name of this to be called group specialty. What we're going to need to do is pass on the data from our repeating group and store it inside of this group. And so this is yet another benefit to working with groups, is that you have the ability to store and pass data into them. So for this group here, I'm going to store the information of a specialty. And for the data source, I'm going to have this group extract the information of the specialty within this cell of our repeating group. So that sounds quite confusing, but perhaps the best way to illustrate that is by opening up the real-world Zocdoc product. So within this repeating group here, the specialty of this cell is primary care, the specialty of this cell is dentist, and so within our second cell here, this group is going to pull the information of a dentist. And so the current cell's specialty here would be a dentist. And so if I jump over to Bubble once again, for the data source, I'm just going to reference the current cell's specialty. So in our first one, it's going to reference our first option. For the second one, it'll reference our second option, and so on. Then if I was to jump back to my visual elements and add an image into this group, I can now insert dynamic data, and what you'll see is that I have the option to reference the parent group specialty. Now the parent group is the cream group because technically my image sits inside of that group. So that group is taking care of that image. It is its parent. So I'm going to reference the parent group specialty. And because that is linked to my option set list, I can now reference from one of my 2 attributes. I can reference the display text or I can reference the image. And that's exactly what I want here. Now, when I'm working with images, just a personal preference of mine is that I like to head down to this additional field and choose to process my images with ImgX. And the reason I do this is because there's this option here to resize and fit the dimensions of each image by cropping them. And so what that's going to do is just expand the scale of each image out, just so that way it fits the dimensions of the image perfectly. So it creates a much nicer end user experience. And this is something you're going to see me do quite a bit throughout our tutorial today. I'm just going to close this here though, because if I scroll on down to my styling, I'm going to detach the default style of this image. Now, while I'm working with images inside of my bubble editor, I'm going to add a solid border around this. So that way I can see where this image actually lies on my page. Of course, when you go to preview or publish your application, you can set this to be none. But for the time being, I think it's important that we should actually be able to see where this image sits while we build our application out. I'll also update the roundness of its borders to be 100, so that way it will become a perfect circle. I can then jump to my layout tab, and when it comes to the width settings of this image, I'm going to set the width here to be 100 pixels. Now I am going to keep this as a fixed value because I only ever want this image to be 100 pixels at any given point in time. I don't want it to be smaller or larger based on the size of my page. I always want it to be 100 pixels. Now, if I also select this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed, I can leave this as a 1:1 ratio, which would now make this a perfect square. So it's 100 pixels by 100 pixels. And you can really start to see our image coming together quite nicely now. I'm also going to horizontally align this in the center of my group, so that way it's always perfectly centered. And then from here, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, so that way it doesn't touch the borders of my group. Now finally below this, I'm going to add in the text which will display the name of this specialty. So if I head to my visual elements, I'm going to grab a text element here. I'll add this in, and if I insert dynamic data, I'm just going to reference the parent group specialties. It's display text. That one is super straightforward. Now look, for this text, I'm going to scroll on down and detach the default style of this because I'd like to update the font size to be 18. And I'm also going to choose to center this text within the element itself. I can then jump over to my layout tab and I'm going to make this text element fully responsive. So if I unselect that this should be a fixed width, I'll set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So now this text is of course going to expand out or shrink based on the size of my page. And if the page does need to shrink, it's going to collapse that text onto a new line. So it's going to create a beautiful responsive experience. I'm also going to update the minimum height here to be 0. And because we have this default option here that's going to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse perfectly around that text. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the bottom, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. So that way this text element won't touch the borders of my group or the image that sits above it there. Now, because that's all of the elements I'll need to add into this group, what I'm going to do is select on my cream group and just close off all of this empty space at the bottom. So if I jump to my layout tab, I'm going to head to my minimum height and I'm going to set that to be 0. And once again, because this option is ticked to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it will collapse perfectly around all of the text there. And now look, we can do the exact same thing for our repeating group. So at the bottom of our repeating group, we have all of this empty space. So what I'm going to do is select on my repeating group, head to my layout tab and update the minimum height to now be 0. And then finally, I'm just going to add in some margins around this repeating group. I'm going to give it 20 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right there. Just so that way the borders of my repeating group don't actually touch the borders of my page. And then finally, the very last thing I'll do is jump over to my appearance tab. And look, this isn't completely necessary, but if you want to go over the top like myself here, what we can do is actually update the minimum height of each row. So because we've finished adding in all of the elements inside of our repeating group here, if I was to set the minimum height to be 0, it's just going to collapse around the height of our elements. So that's just going to ensure that it's going to be pixel perfect. However, we are going to need to keep the minimum width as 220 because if you set this to be 0, what you'll see is it's just going to collapse all of our cells together. So you'll always need a value in the minimum width, but the minimum height you can set to 0 once you've finished adding all of your elements inside of this. Now, what I'd like to do is just quickly open up my responsive tab and show you what this is going to look like. So on a desktop device here, if I was to expand the width of this out, our repeating group is going to be fully responsive. So it's going to continually add a new cell, or perhaps it's going to collapse cells and stack them on top of each other. So this is a perfectly responsive experience. However, I do just want to draw your attention to one thing, and that is my search bar here. So as you'll see, when I expand my page out, my search bar is fully responsive. You just need to remember that users aren't going to be able to see this red color here. You're going to remove that when you go to publish your app. However, when I close the width of this page, what you'll notice is that our search bars are starting to squish on top of each other. And even on the smallest possible device size here, this just doesn't really look great. You can't actually see what any of the text says inside of each of the input field. And so what we're going to need to do is quickly just take some time to make a fully responsive experience here. And something I should just quickly point out is that when it comes to users' device sizes that they're going to be using your application on today, the smallest possible device size you'll see here is going to be 320 pixels. So if a user has something like an iPhone 5, so if this person's still stuck in the Stone Age for some reason, I know it's not your fault that they've been living under a rock for 10 years, but unfortunately we do need to cater for these people on these devices. Now what I do find is that most modern phones So something like an iPhone 14, the dimensions of that device sit around the 380 to 400 pixel mark. So they are a little bit larger. However, the smallest possible device size that anyone could view your app in is going to be 320 pixels. So we need to cater a responsive experience for this exact size here. And if we were to jump over to the real world Zocdoc product and just scroll on up, we can take a look at how they do this. So if I reduce the width of my browser here, what you'll see is that at a certain point, all of these input fields just break and position on top of each other. So that's how they create that truly responsive experience. You'll see right there, it just snaps. And so that is something we can easily replicate within our own application today. But it is going to take a little bit of tinkering to do. So if I just jump over into Bubble here, I feel like I'm really going to overwhelm you with a lot in the very first module of our course today. But look, in my opinion, this is just going to create a beautiful end user experience for anyone that uses our product. So I really want to take the time to make sure that's something that you can offer. So how can we actually create an experience that allows us to stack each of these input fields on top of each other? What we're going to do is select on each input field here. And if we open up our layout tab, you may remember that each input field had a maximum width. So this one was 280, our search box was 300, and our drop-down menu was 500. So right now, each input field is capped to go to a certain maximum width. Whereas what I'm going to do is create an experience that just recognizes when the page is below a certain width. I want each input field to take up as much space as it can. And so then hopefully what's going to happen is that instead of having enough room to display each input field on one line, they're all going to be greedy and they're going to want to take up the entire width of the page, which means there's not going to be enough room for them all on one line. So they're going to have to collapse and then stack on top of each other. And so the first thing we'll need to do is determine at what point we want that to happen on our page. So if you take a look to the left-hand side within your responsive tab here, you're going to be able to see the current width of our page in pixels. So right now it's 1029 pixels. And so if I was to start reducing the width of our page, you'll see that update in real time. And look, I think it's around this mark here that I'd like for our elements to collapse on top of each other. So this is around the 930 pixel mark. So what we're going to do is create an experience that just recognizes when our page is below 930 pixels, we're going to update the maximum width of each of these input fields to be infinite. So if I start by selecting on our drop-down menu, I'm going to open up what's known as our conditional tab. And conditions in Bubble allow you to create some certain behavior that's going to happen whenever a specific requirement is met. And as I just mentioned before, the requirement is when our page is going to be below 930 pixels. I'm going to want to update the behavior, which is the maximum width of this input field. So under our condition, we're going to type in the word width, and we're going to recognize when the current page width is less than, and I'm going to type in 930. So that is 930 pixels. Then what I'm going to do is update the width of this element, and that's going to be our maximum width. And I'm now going to set that as infinite. And then of course from here, I'm going to need to do the exact same thing to my two remaining input fields. But in order to streamline that process, I'm just going to right click on this condition and I'm going to choose to copy this condition. I'm then going to select on my search box. I'll open up my conditional tab. I'll right click here and paste in the same condition. And it's going to do the exact same thing. So we don't need to rebuild that from scratch. We can easily just paste in the existing condition we created. I'll then do the exact same thing for our date picker. So I'm going to select on this input, open up our conditional tab, right click and paste in that same condition. Now another thing I should quickly just point out is that over in the real world Zocdoc product, when the width of our page reduces and all of these elements stack on top of each other, what you'll see is that the little search button becomes this long button here with text inside of it, not an icon. So what we're going to do is create a condition that just recognizes when our page is below that 930 pixel mark. I'm going to hide this button and I'm going to display a different button. So if I jump back into Bubble, I'm going to select on our group. So this is our group search button. I'm going to right click and paste our same condition in before. However, for the condition, I'm not going to update the maximum width of this group. Instead, what I'm going to do is select that this group should be visible and I'm going to untick that should be true, which now means that when the page is below 930 pixels, this group will not be displayed. Now what you can see is that although this group is not being shown, it's still taking up a little bit of space on my page. So if we just jump to my layout tab, I'm just going to quickly tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden, which just means that when it's not being shown, it's no longer going to take up any space on my page. Now look, when that button is being hidden, what I'd like to do is add another button that's going to be displayed to take its place. And that's going to be the long version of our button, which displays the text inside of it, not an icon. So what we're going to need to do is quickly just jump back to our UI builder here. We're going to head to our visual elements and just add a button into our red group. Now, when it comes to this button, I'm going to update the text inside of this to display the words find care. Then I'm also going to need to update the color of this button. Now, instead of detaching the style of this button like I've previously done throughout our tutorial for every single element so far, what I'd like to do instead is actually edit the existing style here. Now, if you're not familiar with styles in Bubble, when it comes to working with elements, if you ever want to change the way something looks, you can always just update any of the options and make it a one-off configuration. But what happens if, let's say, I want to make this button yellow on this page, but then throughout the entirety of my app, whenever I add a button onto it, I also want it to be the exact same shade of yellow. Now, what I could do, of course, is whenever I add a button onto any page in my app, I could manually just change the color of it. However, this is where the benefit to styles comes in. If I choose to edit the style of my primary button here, it's going to take us through to our styles menu. And within this menu, we can update the style of this button once, and then whenever we add a button onto our page and reference the primary button style, it will automatically have these exact same configurations that we create right now. So it's going to save us a ton of time having to reconfigure these same settings over and over again. So you edit it once, and then you can enjoy the benefit of that throughout your entire app. Now, the thing I'm interested in doing today is just updating the background color of this button to be a shade of yellow. Now, if you'd like this color code, it's FEE5A. Then when it comes to the color of this text inside of this button, I'm just going to add in 6 threes here. So it's going to be the shade of brown that I've used before. And then finally, what you also might notice is that under your conditional tab for this style, you can see that there's a condition that's going to update the color of this button whenever it's hovered. So whenever someone puts their mouse over this button, it's going to turn blue. And that's not really the color I want. Instead, I'm just going to add in another shade of yellow here. And if you'd like this color code, it's F0DE36. And if you want to toggle this on and off to see what this is going to look like, this is the color it's going to display when someone puts their mouse over this button. And when they're not hovering over it, it's going to revert back to our original color. Now, if I jump back into my design tab, as you'll see, this button will adopt the styling that we've just added. But of course, if I was to add another button into my app, it's also going to have the exact same styling. So that is the benefit to taking the time to update that style there. What I'm also going to do is just quickly jump to my layout tab and vertically align this in the center of my group. And while I'm in my layout tab, I'm also going to unselect that this should be a fixed width, and I'm going to make this button fully responsive. So I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. And in this case, I am going to leave the maximum width as infinite because I want this button to take up the entirety of my page. Now for the minimum height, I'm also going to set this to be 48 pixels because that is the same height as the input fields we've been working with. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 5 pixels of margin at the top and 5 pixels of margin on the bottom. Now for this button, by default right now, it's currently being displayed on my page at any given point in time. Whereas I actually want this button to be hidden by default, and I'll only ever want it to be shown when our existing group here that acts as a button is no longer going to be visible. So for our new button here, I'm going to unselect that this should be visible on page load, which means it's not going to be shown by default. I'm also going to select this option to collapse it when it's hidden. So that means that when it's not being shown, it's not going to take up any empty space on our page. So if I jump over to my responsive menu, what you'll now see is that that button is hidden by default. But what I'd like to do is just recognize when our existing button here is no longer visible. So at this point right here, what I'd like to do is obviously hide that button, but now display my new button. So for my button, find care, I'm going to jump to my conditional tab here, and I'm going to replicate the exact same condition from our existing button. Only in this case, instead of hiding it, I'm going to actually show it. So I'm going to select on my existing button here. So my group search button. I'm going to right click on this condition and copy it. I can then choose to display my new button here by selecting on it within my elements tree. So if you're not familiar with this, you can just see the name of a hidden element. And if you click on the little eye icon, it will then show it. I'll select on my button. I'll right click and I'll paste that condition in. And instead of having this button no longer be visible, I'm going to tick that it should now be visible. So if I just choose to hide this button again, what I'm going to do is then reduce the width of my page. And when one button is hidden, the next button will be displayed. But of course, right now, it doesn't really behave the way we want it. What we want is for this button to collapse down onto a new line. And we want the exact same thing to happen to all of our input fields that sit within our search bar. So why aren't they doing that? The reason they're not doing this is because if you remember, for every element inside of my red group, under our layout tab, we have a minimum width set to 0, which means that these input fields and this button are going to continually collapse right down to 0 pixels. So if I reduce the width of my page, they're just going to collapse and be squished. So what I'm going to need to do is actually give all of these elements a minimum width. And if I was to set the minimum width to be something like 500 pixels, what that means is that this button will always require 500 pixels in minimum width. It's going to break down onto a new line so we can get that space. So in order to create that experience, I'm actually going to jump to my conditional tab, and under my existing condition here, where the current page width is less than 930 pixels, what I'm also going to do is type in to update the minimum width, and I'm going to set that to be 500 pixels. I'm then going to do the exact same thing for our 3 input elements that sit beside our button. So if I select on our date time picker, I'm going to update the minimum width, and I'm going to set that to now be 500 pixels as well. I'll then do this for our search box. So I'll also update the minimum width on our existing condition, and I'm going to set this one to also be 500 pixels. And then finally, I'm going to do the exact same thing for our drop-down menu. So under our existing condition, I'm going to update the minimum width, and that will now be 500 pixels. And as you can see, this is really starting to come together quite nicely. So when our first button hides, our new button will be displayed. And because all of these input fields here now have a minimum width of 500 pixels, and because our page is currently less than 1000 pixels, it can only display one input field on one line. Because if you think about it, 2 input fields would be 500 pixels plus 500 pixels, which gives us 1000 pixels in total. And we don't have 1000 pixels to display 2 side by side. So what it's going to do is break down, and because it has an infinite maximum width, it's just going to take up all of that remaining space. Now this has created the exact experience we want, but there is just one small caveat. Because the minimum width is currently 500 pixels, this means that when the page shrinks below 500 pixels, we're going to run into another problem. And that is that we've just ran out of space to display all of these input fields. And so because each of our elements won't shrink below 500 pixels, we just don't have enough room to display them on our page. So what can we do to help that? What we could actually do is create yet another condition and just recognize when our page goes below a certain width, we could once again update the minimum width for each of these elements one last time. And so what we're going to do is define yet another brand new condition on our drop-down menu here. And we're just going to recognize when the current page width is less than, and when it comes to sourcing that value, it's around about the 540 pixel mark that our input fields will run out of space. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. If the minimum width is 500 pixels, why is it at the 540 pixel mark that they're deciding to run out of space? One thing you just need to remember is that if we click on our red group here, it has 20 pixels of margin on each side. So we're going to need to take 500 pixels plus 20 plus 20, which gets us that 540 pixel mark. And so that's why when it comes to the current page width here, I'm going to set this to be 540 pixels. So when the current page width is less than 540 pixels, what I'd like to do is once again update the minimum and maximum width for this input field. So for the minimum width, what I'm going to do is set this to be 280 pixels. Now there is a specific reason why I selected 280 pixels. So if we think about it, at the smallest possible mobile device size at 320 pixels here, so this is something like an iPhone 5. If we have 320 pixels and then 20 pixels of margin on each side of our red group, that's 320 minus 20 minus 20, which gets us to 280 pixels perfectly. I'm then also just going to make sure that the maximum width is still infinite. So that way of the remaining space it has, it's going to take up all of the space it can. I'm then going to choose to right click on this new condition and make a copy of this. And I'm just going to copy and paste it across all of our remaining elements within our red group. So for our search box, I'm going to right click here and paste in that new condition. I'll do the exact same thing for our date time picker. So I'll right click and paste that in. And then finally, we'll do the same thing for our button. So we're going to right click and paste that in. Now look, I know that if you are brand new to Bubble, this is going to be incredibly overwhelming. There's a lot of different settings that I've just explained to you here. But this is how you do create a truly responsive experience, regardless of whatever device size someone is using. So right now you can see on a desktop, this is going to look beautiful. When we then break it down to something like a tablet, or even if someone reduces the width of their browser, it's still going to look great. And then if we break it down even further to an incredibly small mobile device, this whole search bar is going to be fully responsive at any given point in time. And now look, that is the very last thing I wanted to cover within this particular module here. What I'd love to do is just run a quick preview of our application so you can see what this homepage is going to look like. Over in a preview of my application here, you can see that we've created the framework for our Zocdoc homepage. Now look, as I mentioned at the start of this module, we do still need to build out our navigation menu, but I wanted to break that down into a separate section of our tutorial today because honestly, we've already done so much within our homepage and there was a lot I needed to cover. So obviously at the top here, we have our search bar, and below at the bottom here, we have our list of specialties. So this is pulling data from our database, which of course had stored our option sets we created. Now, of course, when I reduce the width of this page, this is going to be fully responsive. So not only is our search box going to adapt, but if I also scroll on down, you'll see our repeating group will continually collapse and create a fully responsive experience as well. Just jumping back into our Notion checklist, we can finally tick off that we've finished building out our homepage. Now look, in comparison to some of the other modules we're going to cover today, this one was a fairly big module. Particularly because it was the first module out of the gate, I wanted to try and explain things in as much detail as I could. So I do apologize that it took so long, but particularly when we're working with things like repeating groups and responsive design settings, I wanted to make sure I covered everything you need to know. But thankfully from here, when it comes to the rest of our application, we're just going to be building on top of concepts that we already now understand after bringing this page to life. Working my way down the list of features in my checklist here, the next thing we're going to focus on is how we can create a navigation menu. Now look, of course, this is going to be an essential feature for any application you create inside of Bubble. So what you learn here today is going to be applicable for any app you build in the future. Now look, when it comes to our navigation menu, I'm actually going to break this down into two separate modules. Within the first module here, I'm just going to focus on how we can actually build the overall framework and the workflows that will power the menu itself. And then in our second module, I'm just going to then focus on how we can make that menu responsive across a mobile device. Just because there is quite a few details involved with that, and I just don't want to overwhelm you right away. So what we're going to do is jump over into our Bubble editor here. And look, when it comes to the process of creating a navigation menu, because we're going to want to display a series of elements horizontally across our page, we're going to need to add a group onto our page and set its container layout to be a row. So traditionally, if you wanted to create a navigation menu, what you could do is scroll on down to your containers menu, grab a group, add this on your page, and just move it to the very first position on your page. So whatever you add in the top here is going to be within your navigation menu. However, I am not going to do this. Instead of building this group out on our home page, what I'm going to do is actually create this as what's known as a reusable element. Now, as the name would suggest, reusable elements are a powerful feature in Bubble that allow you to reuse elements across multiple pages in your app. They're kind of like styles for elements. So with things like a navigation menu, where it's going to look the exact same and we need it on every single page throughout our app, I don't want to have to manually build this out on each individual page. Instead, what I'd like to do is build the navigation menu once and then easily just add it to any single page that I create in the future. So what I'm going to do is delete this group off my page. And in order to build out a reusable element, we're going to need to open up our page drop-down menu, and right at the bottom, you're going to see this option to add a reusable element. Now what I'm going to do is call this my header menu, because this is going to be the menu that's displayed at the top of my page. So almost like it's within the header. I'm then going to choose to create this. It's going to build that element and it's going to redirect me through to what looks like a separate page within my editor. But if I was to double click on this element and head to my appearance tab, what you'll notice is that with a reusable element, by default, this is now set to be a group, which is why it's not taking up the full size of a normal page, because this is just a group element and whatever we add here is going to sit inside of that group. Now with reusable elements, you can choose between a couple of different options. So there's groups, pop-ups, and floating groups, but you don't need to worry about any of these options now. We're going to use the default option, which is a group. So when we're working within this element, it's just going to function and behave the exact same as a normal group would. And so like a standard group, the first thing I'm going to do is actually update the background style. And it is currently a flat color. However, I'm going to set this to be a shade of yellow. So that way it's going to blend in with my homepage. Now this color we're going to use will remain the same. We're not going to, let's say, update the color, and then when we run a preview of our app, we're not going to remove that. This color will always be a permanent color that we want to show. And so if you'd like this color code, it's FFDEB. Then from here, we're going to jump over to our layout tab, and we're going to update the container layout of this group. So when it comes to a header menu, when you think about it, we're going to display a series of different options. So in the far left-hand corner of our menu, we're going to have the Zocdoc logo. Then on the right-hand side, we're going to have some text elements and things like a user's profile photo. So that way, when they click on those text elements, it can redirect them through to the relevant page within our app. So because I'm going to be stacking all of these elements horizontally across my page, I'm going to set the container layout for this group to be a row. And what you'll now see is that we have the ability to update some additional settings. So for the width of our UI builder here, I'm going to set this to be 960 pixels. And the reason for that is because that is a good size for a small desktop device. Now, it doesn't really matter what you set the width for your UI builder to be here. This is purely just the width that you see inside of your bubble editor. Because what you will notice is that the real minimum and maximum width here is 0 and infinite. So this group is actually going to be fully responsive by default. So if I open up my responsive tab here, and if I scale the page out, as you'll see, the group will scale accordingly. And if I shrink it down, because this group has a minimum width of 0, it's also going to shrink accordingly. The 960 pixels is just what it's going to format as while we're working on this element here. But it's of course not going to determine what the width of this is when we actually preview our application. And look, now from here, we can start adding all of the elements we need within our header menu. So as I mentioned before, on the left-hand side, I'm going to start by adding in a logo, and that's going to be the Zocdoc logo. So if I head to my visual elements, I'm going to grab an image, I'll add this in, and I'm just going to take the time to upload a static image here, because I'm going to upload an image that's not going to change. It will always be the exact same image. So that's why I'm going to use the static option. I'm going to upload an image I have stored on my local device here. And with this image, I've also taken the time to upload a version of this to the Google Drive, which I mentioned in our previous module. So you'll already have access to this exact same image I'm going to use right now. After uploading this image though, as you can see, it's quite squished. The aspect ratio isn't really correct. So if we jump over to our layout tab, what I'm going to do is just choose to update, first of all, the width of this image. I'm going to set it to be 200 pixels, and I'm going to leave this as a fixed value, because I'm always going to want this image to be the exact same size. So it will always be 200 pixels in width. I'm also going to select this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed, and by default, it's automatically going to adjust to the relevant aspect ratio of this image. So right now it's 60 by 23, so that's perfect. I'm also then going to vertically align this image in the center of my yellow group, and then finally add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right there. And that is all I'll need to change for this image. It's configured exactly how I want it. What I'm then going to do is build out a separate group, which I'd like to display on the right-hand side of my menu. And I'm going to start by creating a group that's displayed when a user is not logged into an account. So within that group, it should display some text that prompts someone to either log into an account or create a new account. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is actually add a group within my existing group here. So I'm going to scroll on down. I'm going to head to my containers menu, and I'm just going to add a group into my yellow group. Now, the first thing I'll do is update the name of this. I'm going to call this group logged out, because this is the group that's going to display to a user when they're not logged into an account. So when they are logged out. I'm also going to move this to the next position, so that way it sits on the right-hand side of my logo. Then when it comes to this group, I'm going to jump to my appearance tab, detach the default style of this, because what I'd like to do is set a flat background color. And for the sake of while we're working in our bubble editor, I'm going to set this color to be red, just so that way I can easily distinguish where this group sits within my overall menu. Now, unlike the background color of our overall group here, You will be able to remove the background star from this when you go to preview your app. The red color code right here is purely just so we can see where this sits inside of our group. Then from here, I'm going to jump to my layout tab because what I'd like to do is update the container layout of this group. And look, when it comes to the container layout, you can either choose between a row or a column. It doesn't really matter. We're only going to be adding one element into this group anyway. So it's not like we need to stack elements on top of each other or beside each other. So I'm personally just going to select the column option. I'm then going to update the width of this group. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And for the time being, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. I'm then going to add my first and only element into this red group. And then I'm going to come back and update the height and the margins around this group. And so when it comes to the element that will be displayed in this group, I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements. I'm going to grab a text element and I'll add that into my red group. Now for this text element, I'm just going to have this display some static text. So this is going to display the words login/sign up. I'll then scroll on down to my style and detach the default style. I'll update the font size to be 18. I can then jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to make this element fully responsive. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0. I can then leave the maximum width as infinite. I'll do the exact same thing for my height. I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0. And of course, because this default option is selected to fit the height of the element to the content within it, it will collapse nicely around that text. And that is everything I'll need to change when it comes to the layout settings for this text. So what I'm going to do is select on my group. And as you can see, we have all of this empty space sitting around this text element. So what I'm going to do is first of all, update the minimum height here to be 0. And that's going to collapse around that text. But what you'll also notice is that we still have all of this empty space horizontally. So what I'm going to do is actually select this option here under our width settings. So right now the maximum width is set as infinite, which means this group can take up as much space as it needs on my page. But what I'm going to do is select this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And that just means that it's going to collapse perfectly around the text inside of the group. Now that's the exact experience we want to create today. I'm then going to update the vertical alignment of this group so it's positioned in the center of my yellow group. So if I select the centered option here, as you'll see, it's going to be positioned perfectly next to my logo. And then finally, while I'm in my layout tab, I'm going to scroll on down and I'm just going to update my margins. I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the bottom, none on the left, but 20 on the right. And at this point in time, we've finished adding everything into this group, but our header menu doesn't look quite right. As I mentioned before, I want this group to be positioned on the right-hand side of my menu, not directly beside my logo. So what I'm going to do is actually select on my overall group. So this is my header menu. And if I go to my layout tab, you'll see the option to update the container alignment. Now I've previously touched base on this, but the container alignment just determines how all of the elements inside of your group will be aligned and positioned. So right now, everything is aligned to the left-hand side. So at the moment, everything's being aligned to the left-hand side. So it's being pushed across to the left. If I wanted to center everything, it would be positioned perfectly in the center. But if you select on the very last option here called space between, what you'll see is that Bubble's going to push both of these elements to the end of each side, and it's going to leave an even amount of space between both of these elements. And as you'll now see, that's how we're going to create the header menu experience we need today. And it's at this point in time, you can start to see our header menu come together quite nicely. One thing I should just point out though, is that when it comes to this text here, I'm obviously going to want to display this to users who have not logged into an account, because we're going to prompt them to log in or sign up for our application. But what happens when a user has taken the time to already log into their account? I actually wouldn't want to display this group anymore. And instead, I'd want to display a different group which gives the user much more options in terms of the pages in which they can navigate to. So what I'm going to do is select on my text element, then I'm going to right click and select its first parent. So because our text element sits inside of that red group, that group is known as the parent because it's taking care of our text. So right now within your property editor, this should display the text group logged out. So we're editing our red group. Now what I'm going to do is actually jump to my layout tab and unselect that this element should be visible on page load. So it's going to be invisible by default. I'm also going to tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden. So that way when it's not being shown, it's not going to take up any empty space on my page. But of course now this group is not being shown at all. So I'm going to need to create a condition which just recognizes that when the user is logged out, so when they're not signed in, I should display this group. So that way they're prompted to then log in or create a new account. So if I head to my conditional tab, I'm going to define a condition and I'm just going to recognize when the current user, so the current user is the person who is currently viewing your application. And even if they don't have a registered account, they will still just be referred to as the current user. When that person is logged out, so that just means when they don't have an account, what I'm going to do is select that this element is visible and I will tick that that should be true. And you can choose to toggle this on and off to see what that's going to look like. So now if the user is logged out, this group will be displayed. But of course, what happens if the user does log in? And look, later on throughout our tutorial today, I am going to explain how we can create a login and register feature. But for now, what I'd like to do is just create the menu that's going to be displayed to someone that has logged into their account. So what I'm going to do is actually toggle this condition off. So that way that group is hidden. Then I'm going to build out an entirely separate group. And we're going to create a condition that just recognizes that it should only be displayed whenever a user is logged into their account. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu. I'm going to grab a group here. I'll add this into my yellow group. And the first thing I'll do is update the name of this. I'm going to call this group logged in, because this of course is going to be the group that's displayed to someone who is logged into an account. I'm then going to head to my appearance tab. And the first thing we'll do, similar to before, is just attach the default style and give this a flat background color. Now, for the sake of our tutorial today, I'm going to set this color to be a light shade of blue, just so that way I can easily differentiate between my two groups. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab. And when it comes to the elements I'll be adding into this group, I'm going to be adding quite a few different text elements that will be positioned horizontally across our page. Now, when I use the word horizontal, that of course means we'll need to update the container layout to be a row, because we're going to be stacking elements side by side. I'm then going to make this group fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So it's going to take up as little or as much space as it can. Now I will come back later on and update the width to fit the size of the content inside of it. But right now there is no content inside of it. So if we were to select that, it would just collapse to 0. So what we now need to do is build out all of the elements I'd like to display inside of this group. And when it comes to this group, I'm actually going to build this from the right side to the left. So the very first element I'd like to add in if someone is logged into their account is their profile photo. So I'm going to head over to my visual elements and grab an image element. I'll add this into my blue group. And when it comes to this image, we're going to insert dynamic data, because I'd like to reference some data that already exists in my database and display an image. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and I'm going to reference the current user. So the current user in this scenario is the person who is logged into their account and is viewing our application. And as you'll see, because this is linked to our user data type, we can reference all of the data fields within that. So in this case, I'm going to pull the profile photo. It's as simple as that. What I would just like to do though, when I work with images, particularly dynamic images, is I just want to select this option to process this image with ImgX, just so that way I can resize to fit the dimensions by cropping this image. So that way it scales this image out to the full size that we give it. I'm then going to choose to close this and you'll see that that will validate. I'll then scroll on down and detach the default style of this, because what I'd like to do is add a solid border around this image while we're working on it. So that way we can easily see where it sits on my page. I'll also update the roundness of this image's borders to be 100. So that way it does become a perfect circle. And then finally, we'll just need to update the size and the dimensions for this image. So within our layout tab here, what I'm going to do is update the width of this image to be 50 pixels. And I'm going to keep this as a fixed value because I will always want it to be 50 pixels. I'm also then going to tick this option to keep this image's aspect ratio fixed. So that way it will be 50 pixels by 50 pixels. I can then vertically align this in the center of my blue group. And finally, I'll add in 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 on the left. I'm then going to add a text element beside this image. And I'm going to add this in front of the image. Now, I should also just point out that if you ever need to move your elements around inside a group, you can jump to your layout tab and you'll see the option to move this to the next position, the last position, and vice versa, the previous position or the first position. You can also drag these around if you really wanted, but sometimes I find it easier to just move these manually by clicking this button. Now, within this text element, I just want to display the name of the person who is currently logged in. So what I'm going to do is jump to my Appearance tab. I will insert dynamic data. So I'm going to reference data from my database. And I'm going to pull through the current user, their name. It's super straightforward. I'd like to then scroll on down and detach the default style of this, just because I'd like to update the font size to be 18. And then finally, I'm going to jump to my Layout tab, because what I'd like to do is just update the width for this text element. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. But look, when it comes to the maximum width, I actually don't really need much space to display someone's name. When you think about it, it's only ever 2 to 3 words. So I don't need all this empty space here. So what I'm going to do is set a maximum width of 200 pixels. Now, 200 is just a personal preference of mine. I think that's more than enough to display 3 words, as you can see here. So that's why I've just selected 200. By all means, you could set this as whatever value you would like though. But by setting the minimum width to 0, it just means that this is going to be fully responsive. I'll do the exact same thing for the height. I'm going to set the minimum height to 0, and of course it will collapse around the text. I'll vertically align this in the center of my blue group. And then finally, I'll just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, and 10 on the right. So that way this text element isn't directly touching the image beside it there. Look, then from here, what we're going to do is add in a couple of different menu options. So we're going to add in some static text, which will just allow someone to click and navigate between some pages within our app. So in order to actually streamline that process, instead of having to rebuild all of those text elements from scratch, I'm just going to make a copy of our existing text element here. And for this text, I'm just going to head over to my Appearance tab. I'll right click in this field and clear all of that dynamic data, because as I mentioned, I'm just going to add in some static text. So whatever I type here will always remain the same. And the text is just going to be the word appointments. I'll then jump to my Layout tab and I'll make this the first element within my group here. Now, because this is static text, we know exactly how much width this element needs to take up on our page. So what I'm going to do is actually remove that maximum width. And if I tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse perfectly around this word here. And look, the purpose of this text within our application is to just allow someone within our app to click on this and then navigate to the page where they can view a list of all of the appointments that they've made. But in front of this text, I'd like to add in another menu option. So I'm going to make another copy of my text element, only this time the text will display the word dashboard. I'll then jump to my Layout tab and move this to the first position within my blue group. And when this text is clicked, it's going to allow a doctor to view a dashboard with some analytics about their clinic. And then finally, what I'm going to do is make one last copy of this, because the very last menu option I want to add is just going to display some text that says list your clinic on Zocdoc. So if a user is logged in and if they are, let's say, a doctor and they want to list their clinic within our application, they would click on this text and it would take them through to a page where they could do just that. So what I'm going to do now is just jump to my Layout tab and move this to the first position within my blue group. And now that we've finished adding in all of the text elements for our second group here, what I'm going to do is select on the blue group itself. I'm going to jump to my Layout tab and I'm just going to reduce the minimum height here to be 0. And of course, by doing that, it's just going to collapse this group around all of the text inside of it. I'm then going to vertically align this in the center of our main group before finally just adding in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the bottom, and 20 on the right there. And now as I look over all of the text elements within our group, I think I might actually just make a few more minor tweaks, So if I was to click on our first text element, I can see that there's only 10 pixels of margin between both of our text elements beside each other. So what I'm going to do is actually up that to be 20 pixels of margin on the right, just so there's some additional space, so that way all our text elements aren't squished together. I'm going to then click on our dashboard text, do the exact same thing. So I'm going to set the right margin to be 20. I'll then do the same thing for our appointments text. So its right margin will also be 20, not 220. And when it comes to the text that displays the current user's name, I think I'm also going to tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. But I am still going to keep the maximum width to be 200 pixels. And so that way, even if a user does have a really long name, it's not going to display that all the way across our navigation menu. Instead, it's just going to stack that text on top of each other. But for this text element, I'm going to keep the right margin here to be 10, just because I do want it to be close to the profile photo, because these two text elements are in fact related. Now, similar to our previous menu before, what we're going to need to do is select on our blue menu here. And we're going to need to hide this menu by default and create a condition that only allows us to display this menu when a user is in fact logged in. So within our layout tab, I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. I'm then going to choose to collapse this element when it's hidden. I'll then jump to my conditional tab. I'm going to define a condition and I'm just going to recognize when the current user is in fact logged in. So if I scroll on down, I'm going to reference is logged in. What I'd then like to do is update that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. And of course, I can toggle this on and off if you want to see what that's going to look like. And now, although within our overall navigation menu, it currently looks like these two elements are squished together, if I was to open up my responsive tab here and view this on a large desktop device, what you'll see is that if I hide my logged out group and display my logged in group, the reason it looks like this is because if I double click on our group and open up our layout tab, what we still need to do here is cap the width of this group. So right now it has an infinite maximum width. So if I tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it, it will collapse nicely around all of the elements. And as you'll now see, this is more akin to what the experience is going to look like on a desktop device. Now, if you were to try and reduce the width of your page right now, what you'll see is that this group is not going to be fully responsive. And so that's why in our next module, I'm going to explain how we can create a mobile version of this navigation menu. It's going to function in its own unique way, but for the time being on a desktop, this is going to look just fine. So what I'd now like to do is actually build out all of the workflows that are going to run whenever a menu option is clicked here. So if I jump to my UI builder and within my elements tree, if I just open up my group logged in, so if I click my little eye icon, what I can do is start to build out the workflows that run whenever someone clicks on a relevant option. So I'm going to double click on my first text here. So this is the list your clinic on Zocdoc. And what I'm going to do is choose to add a workflow whenever this text element is clicked. And I've just realized that this is actually the first workflow we're going to create within our tutorial today. So workflows in Bubble are essentially the visual programming we're going to create, and they're super easy to use. So as I just mentioned, whenever this text is clicked, we can now create an action that's going to run. And the action I want to reference is within our navigation menu, and I'm going to choose to send someone to a page. So I'm going to choose the go to page action. Now at this point, our destination page does not yet exist. So these are all of the pages within our app. So what we're going to need to do is create a new page, and I'm going to call this page the manage page, because this is where someone can manage or create a clinic. I'll choose to create this here. Then what you'll see is that if I open up this drop-down menu once again, we can now reference that that is going to be the destination page where someone will be sent to. Now look, thankfully, that's all we'll need to add into this workflow. It is super straightforward. What I am just going to do though is show you a great little tip in Bubble, and that is if I click on the workflow trigger, so the trigger that recognizes when the text is clicked, under your event colors, you can choose to actually allocate a color to your workflows. So you can color code them. And I personally just like to set my navigation workflows to be red. So that way at any point in my application, if I see a red workflow, I know that that is a workflow that sends someone through to a separate page. It just helps me keep track of things. Now, by all means, this isn't completely necessary, but this is just a little tip I thought would be useful for you. If I then jump back into my design tab, I'm going to select on my dashboard text. I'll double click on this, I'll add a new workflow, and I'm going to do the exact same thing again. So I'm going to head to our navigation menu, choose the go to page action, and at this point, the destination page does not yet exist. So I'm going to choose to create a new page, and the page name is going to be the dashboard. I'll then create this, I'll open up my drop-down menu, and I'll select that that should be our destination page. Once again, I'll then select on my workflow trigger and update the event color here to be red. I'll jump back into my design tab and do the exact same thing for our appointments text. I'll double click on this, choose to add a new workflow. Within this, once again, we'll choose from the navigation events, select the go to page action, and we'll need to create a brand new page. So I'm going to open up my drop-down menu, select to create a new page here. And for this page, I'm just going to call this the activity page, because this is going to display all of the activity that someone does within their account. So when they book an appointment, it's going to show that on this page. I'll then choose to create this here, and I can now set that as my destination page. I'll then select on my workflow trigger and update this to be red. I'll jump back to my design tab, and for the current user's name, I'm going to add a workflow, and we're going to send someone through to their settings page. So this is where they can update all of their account details. So once again, we're going to choose from a navigation event, select the go to page action. We're going to need to create a brand new page. And of course, we'll be calling this our settings page. We can create that. The destination page will now be our settings page. And I'm going to select on the workflow trigger and update the event color to be red. And then finally, we're going to do the exact same thing for our profile photo. So it's also going to send someone through to our settings page. So I'm going to click on the image element. I'll add a workflow. And within this, once again, we'll choose the navigation event, the go to page action, and we'll be sending someone through to our settings page. Then from here, we can select on our workflow trigger and update the event color to be red. And that is exactly how you can create your very first workflows inside of Bubble. These kind of navigation events are super straightforward because we're not actually sending data through to these pages, which I'll explain later on throughout our tutorial. But for now, we're just sending a user to the page. So it's super simple. We'll then jump back into our design tab here because there is a few minor tweaks we just need to adjust before we've finished building out our header menu. And that is that when it comes to all of these text elements here that are displayed, I actually don't want all of these to be shown at once to a user. So for instance, I don't want to display this dashboard text to a user who's not registered as a doctor, because if they don't own a clinic, they won't have a dashboard to view. And the same goes for our appointments. When it comes to that activity page, I'm only going to display appointments that someone has booked. And if someone is a doctor, they shouldn't see this. Instead, when it comes to the doctor's list of appointments that they have scheduled, I'm actually going to display that within my dashboard page. So what we're going to need to do is create some sort of way to hide and display each of these text elements based on the current user's account. Now, thankfully, if I was to open up my data tab and head to my data types and open my user data type specifically, you may remember there was a data field under our user which stored their profile type. And by default, this was listed as a patient. But later on throughout our tutorial today, we're going to build out a way for someone to upgrade their account to become a doctor. But I just wanted to show you this because we can easily reference between one of these two options. So in our design tab, I'm going to first of all click on my appointments text here. And what I'm going to do is head to my layout tab and unselect that this should be visible on page load. Then I'm going to collapse this element when it's hidden. So that way it doesn't take up any empty space in my menu. I'm then going to need to jump to my conditional tab and I'm going to define a condition and I'm just going to recognize when the current user, so the person who is logged in, when their profile type is a patient. So if I scroll on down to my option sets, I'm going to reference the patient text. What I'd like to do is select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. And if I choose to toggle this on, as you'll see, this text will now be displayed. I'm going to then do the exact same thing for my dashboard text, but it's going to be the inverted version of that condition. So what I'm going to do is quickly just jump to my layout tab, unselect that this should be visible on page load, collapse this element when it's hidden. I'll then jump to my conditional tab and I'll define a condition that just recognizes when the current user, when their profile type is in fact a doctor, not a patient. What I'm going to do is select that this element should be visible and leave that ticked. So that way when this condition is toggled on, as you'll see, this text element will be displayed. Then from here, there's just one very last condition I'll need to create, and that is on my text that displays the words, list your clinic on Zocdoc. So by default, I'd like to display this to any user. But let's say if a user has taken the time to obviously create an account, but then list their clinic on Zocdoc, we know that this person owns a clinic because in our database, we have a data field under our user data type called owned clinic. And this of course is going to store the information of a specific clinic here. So when someone becomes a doctor and registers their clinic, we're going to store that information under their account. And in that case, we no longer want to display the text, list your clinic on Zocdoc, because by that point, they've already listed their clinic. Instead though, what we might like to do is update this text to display the word something like manage your clinic. So that way, instead of creating a new clinic listing, what they could do is actually edit the details of their existing listing. So we're going to be sending someone through to the same page regardless, but I'd just like to update this text for the sake of the end user experience. So what I'm going to do is define a condition. Now we don't need to go to our layout tab and unselect any options here because as I mentioned, this text element will always be displayed. But what we need to do is create a condition that just recognizes when the current user, when their clinic that they own is not empty. So if I scroll on down and select this is not empty option, meaning that that data field would in fact have a clinic stored within it. What I'm going to then do is update the text here, and this will just display the words manage your clinic. And if I was to toggle this on and off, this is what this is going to look like. Now look, thankfully that is the very last condition we need to build out for our entire menu here. The last thing we'll just need to take care of though is if we double click on our overall menu. So this is the yellow group, so our header menu. We can now jump to our layout tab and we can close off all of this empty space that sits around our group and our logo. So if we update the minimum height here to be 0, it's going to collapse nicely around each of those elements. And that is everything we need to cover when it comes to building our reusable header menu. But of course, right now, we need to add this onto our homepage. So if we just digress and jump back over to our homepage. So if we open our drop-down menu and select our index page here, what we can do is just scroll right down to the bottom of our elements tree. And I'm just going to move my head out of the way for a second, because down at the bottom, you're going to see this option to reference any reusable elements that you've created. And of course, we've just built out our header menu. So if I add this anywhere on my page, as you'll see, instead of having to rebuild this menu from scratch, it's just going to automatically add it onto our page. But of course, I want this to be positioned as the first element on my page. So it should sit right at the top there. And of course, because the color of our group is the same as the color of our hero section on our homepage, these two elements are going to blend in perfectly. Now, another thing you'll notice is that when it comes to your reusable element, when you hover or click on this, you won't actually be able to make any changes to this element on your index page. Instead, if you ever need to make changes to your reusable element, you'll have to open up your page drop-down menu and select to make changes within the element itself. And of course, any changes you make here will be reflected across any part of your app where you reference this reusable element. So let's say I have 5 pages in my app and I've added my reusable header menu to each of those pages. If I was to then change the logo of this reusable element, it would be updated across every single page. So that's the beauty of reusable elements. They allow you to easily just make changes once and then have those be applied across any section of your app where you reference this element. Now look, that is everything we need to build out within this section of our tutorial today. What I'd just like to do is run a quick preview of our application here, so that way you can see how this menu is going to function. And look, over in a preview of my app, as you'll probably see, because I'm currently not logged in or registered as a user, we have our red group being displayed on the right-hand side of my menu here. So that way right now I can tell that all of those conditions are correct. Now, one last thing I did forget to do is build out a navigation workflow whenever our Zocdoc logo is clicked. So when this logo is clicked, I'd just like to send someone back through to the home page. So in order to do that, we're just going to quickly jump back into our bubble editor, open up our reusable element, double click on our image and choose to add a workflow whenever this logo is clicked. And look, within this workflow, we're just going to once again select from a navigation menu, choose the go to page action, and we'll set the destination page here to be the index page, which is the home page of our app. We can then select on the workflow trigger and just update the event color to be red. And that is everything we'll need to build out. So what I'm going to do is just jump back into my Notion checklist and we can tick off that we've finished building out our navigation menu. And as I mentioned, because this is a reusable element, you can easily reference your hard work across any other page that we create within our Zocdoc clone today. For the sake of our tutorial today, what I'd like to do is actually jump ahead through our list of features and now take the time to focus on the feature where we're going to actually list a clinic within our Zocdoc clone. So within this, we're not only going to learn how a user can become a doctor within our platform, but also how they can list and publish their clinic within the marketplace of doctors that we're creating. Now look, within this module, there is quite a bit that we need to cover. But thankfully, it's nothing that we can't handle within Bubble. So what we're going to do is jump over into our Bubble editor. And you may remember that when we built out our navigation menu, we had previously created this page called Manage. And perhaps before I open up this page, I should actually just quickly reiterate how we're going to get there. So if I quickly just open up my header menu and open up my group logged in. Within this, you're going to see this text here that displays the words, list your clinic on Zocdoc. So when someone clicks on this text, we're going to send them through to our manage page, which at this point in time is blank. We haven't made any changes to it, which of course means that we're going to need to take care of some housekeeping in terms of setting out the container layout and the navigation menu on our page before we can then go on to build out this whole experience. So let's just focus on that right now. So if I double click on this page, what we're going to do is head over to our layout tab and just set the container layout to be a column. Because of course, like any other page, we're going to be stacking elements from top to bottom. We're also then going to add our reusable navigation menu on this page. So I'm just going to move my head out of the way. We're going to scroll on down and I'm going to grab a header menu from our reusable elements, and I'll put that on my page right there. Then from here, we can now focus on how we're actually going to build out this entire page. And perhaps what I should do is even just show you an example of what we're about to create. So if I jump over to a separate browser here, here's an example of what we're going to be recreating today. So when someone comes to this page, you'll see that they have the option to add in all of the details about their clinic. So this is things like their clinic name, the address, the website, the phone number, and so on. Then from here, what's going to happen is someone's going to click this create button. And when they do that, we're going to build out a workflow that not only updates their account to become a doctor, but we're also then going to create a new clinic within our database. Then once they create that clinic, there's still an important thing they need to do, and that is select their availability. So that way patients know when they can actually book appointments at that clinic. So after they click this button and we create a clinic, we're going to hide this group that you see here, and then we're going to display this second group. And within this group, we have a repeating group, which displays a list of all of the available time slots that a clinic could choose from. So this is where they let us know their availability. And in order to do that, they're just going to simply be able to click in this little circle here, and that's going to mark that as an available slot that they're willing to take on each day. And so as you can see here, we have two separate groups, but as I also just mentioned, only one of these will be displayed at any given point in time. So what we're first going to do is just focus on building out this very first group here. So let's jump over into our main bubble editor and start by adding that group onto our page. So if we head to our containers menu, I'm going to grab a group element. And the first thing I'll do with this group is actually just update the name of this. I'm going to call this group step 1 because this is the first step in the process of listing a new clinic. Before we update the layout of this group, I'm just going to quickly jump to my appearance tab and I'm going to detach the default style of this. Now for the background color, I'm quite happy to leave this as it is. However, I would just like to add a solid border around this group and set the roundness of its borders here to be 20. So that way it has curved edges. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab. And as you saw, within that existing group, we had all of the elements stacked from top to bottom, which means we're going to need to set the container layout of this group to be a column. So if I jump back into our main editor, we'll set the container layout here to be a column. And then we'll need to make this group fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And as you probably guessed, we're going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So that way this group can take up as little or as much space as it needs on our page. Now we are going to come back later on and update the height and the margin of this group, but for the time being, what we're going to do is build out all of the elements that are going to sit inside of it. And the very first element is going to be this heading here, which just displays the words, "Let's get the details about your clinic." Now what you'll also notice is that within this text element, I actually have an icon, and that icon sits directly inside this text element. So as you'll see, you can see I've added a little bit of HTML here. And so what we're going to do is replicate this, and I'm going to explain everything you need to know about doing just this. So if we jump over into our main editor, we're going to scroll on up to our visual elements. We're going to grab a text element, and we're going to add this into our main group. And when it comes to adding an icon element directly inside a text element, as I just mentioned before, you can do this using some very basic HTML. And I'm going to walk you through the process of how I do that. All you need to do is add an open square bracket, followed by the letters FA, and then a closed square bracket. Then beside this, all you're required to do is just add the name of an icon. So if we grab an icon element quickly, what you can do is search for any icon within this library. And I just know that the icon I'm looking for is called paste. So if I was to click on this icon here, beside the letters that say FA, what you'll see is the name of the icon. So this icon here is called paste, as I just mentioned. So if I was to then select on my text element once again and type in the word paste, all I'm required to then do is just close off the HTML formatting. So in order to do that, I need to add another open square bracket. But before I add in the letters FA, I just need to add in a / just to signify that this is the end of my HTML formatting. So I'm going to add in that / followed by the letters FA and then a closed square bracket. And as you'll see, that's going to format exactly how I want it. Then from here, I could just type in the rest of my static heading, which is just going to display the words, "Let's get the details about your clinic." Then from here, we can scroll on down and update the styling of this text. So I'm going to detach the default style. I'm going to set the font size to be 22. I'll choose to bold this. I might also just quickly remove this icon. I don't need that anymore. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab and make this fully responsive. So as you probably guessed, I'm going to unselect that should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Then I'm also going to set the minimum height to be 0, so that way it collapses around all of the text. And then finally, when it comes to the margins for this element, I'm just going to add 30 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and then 20 on the right. Then below this text element, I'm going to add yet another. But in order to streamline that process, I'm just going to make a copy of our existing heading, and we're just going to change the styling settings. So if I jump to my appearance tab, I'm just going to delete all of this text here, and this will just now display the words clinic name. I'm also then just going to update the font size to be 14, but I'm happy to keep this in bold. The only thing I will just need to change though is within my layout tab. And of course, we don't need to take the time to update any of the width settings. They've already been copied across, but I just want to update the top margin here to be 20, not 30, just so there's not so much of a gap between these two elements. Below this though, I'm going to add an input field, which is going to allow us to store the name of a clinic that we're about to create. So if we scroll on down to our input fields, I'm going to grab a standard input. I'll add this below this heading. And the first thing I'll need to do is just update the name of this input to be called input clinic name. Then from here, I'm going to jump to my layout tab and I'm going to make this element fully responsive. So once again, I'll unselect that should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0. But when it comes to the maximum width, I'm actually going to set this to be 500. And the reason for that is because I think that this is all of the space we need for this input field. A clinic name isn't going to be very long, so I don't want it to take up the entire width of our group. Now look, 500 is just a personal number that I've selected. If you really wanted to make this 600, 700, by all means, you can do that. But I'm just going to leave mine at 500. I'm also going to leave the height fixed at 48 pixels. I'm quite happy with how it is. However, I would just like to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right there. Then below this input field, I'm going to add yet another. Only in this instance, it's going to allow someone to add in the address of their clinic. And when we're working with an address, I'd like to use a search box, not a standard input field. So similar to our homepage, if you remember, a search box can integrate with Google Maps to pull real-world addresses. So what I'm going to do first is select on my text element and make a copy of that. I'm going to jump to my appearance tab, and then I'm just going to update the name of this to be called clinic address. I'll then scroll on down to my input forms and grab a search box. I'll add this into my group, and the first thing I'll do is update the name of this to be called search box address. Then of course, as I just mentioned, when it comes to the choices style of this search box, I'm going to update this to be a geographic place. And when we do that, it's going to of course allow us to integrate with Google Maps. But just on this point, there's something I would like to point out. If you were to look at the top of your bubble editor, you might notice that you have two existing issues. And by default, pretty much every application will have this. And if we look at these issues, it's just telling us that we need to source our own Google Maps API keys. So if we were to click on this, it's going to take us through to our settings tab and open up our general settings. And then if we were to scroll on down, you're going to see this section here known as your general services API keys. And what Bubble is essentially telling you is that you need to source your own Google Maps API keys. So because this search box integrates with Google Maps to pull real-world addresses, every time someone types in an address, they're telling Google to fetch some information. And look, nothing in life is free. So what you'll need to do is source your own Google Maps API keys. And this is something you will need to do. This isn't an optional setting. In fact, if you don't source your own Google Maps API keys, you'll find that any search box that references an address will not work. So you're required to source your own API keys. Now look, thankfully, when you do create your own API keys, Google is quite generous in terms of how many API requests it lets you make per month. Realistically, it's not until you're going to publish your app and get hundreds of users that you're going to start paying for those requests. So it's perfect when you're just tinkering around and you're starting to build out the MVP of your product. Now, in order to source those API keys, thankfully Bubble has made it as easy as possible. Next to each field here, you're going to see this little link to the documentation that Bubble has provided. And on this page, what you'll see is a great video tutorial where Bubble explains exactly how you can create your own Google developer account, as well as then go on to source and add in your own API keys. And if you don't prefer to use a video, they have written instructions here And they even link out to where you can create your own Google developer account. And it just talks about all of the API services you need to enable, and of course, which fields you should add your API keys in when you work inside of your bubble settings here. And look, this is just something I wanted to point out because I don't want you to get to the point where you're previewing your app and you think that something is wrong with it. As I mentioned, if you don't take the time to do this, your application won't work when it references any real-world addresses. One last thing I should just point out though is that when you create your own Google developer account, you will also need to store your own billing information within that account, or any of the API key services won't work. Now, as I mentioned, Google is quite generous in terms of how much they allow you to use for free, but you will be required to still have some payment information on file, or else any of those services won't work at all. So what I'm going to do is just close that tab, jump back to my design tab, and now we can just focus on building out the rest of this input field. So once we've updated this to reference geographic places, we're going to jump to our layout tab and make this element fully responsive. So we're going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. We'll set the minimum width to be 0. For the maximum width, I'm also going to set this to be 500. So that way it's the exact same width as the input field above it. For the height, I'm quite happy to leave that fixed at 48 pixels, but I'm also just going to add 20 pixels of margin on the left and then 20 pixels of margin on the right. Then below this input field, I still have quite a few that I need to add in. The next input field is just going to allow a user to add in the website for their clinic. So I'm just going to select our very first heading as well as the input field below it. I'm going to make a copy of those. And when it comes to this heading, I'm just going to jump to my appearance tab and have this display the word clinic website. Then I'll select on the input field and I'm going to update the name of this to be called clinic website. That's all I'll need to change. We don't need to update the layout settings because of course we copied this across. I'm then going to make another copy of this input field and the text heading. And I obviously just need to reposition these because they've just been a bit scattered. And within this input field, we're going to allow someone to store the phone number of a clinic. So this is going to be called clinic number. I'm then going to select on my input field and update the name of this to be called clinic phone number. And contrary to what you might think, I'm going to leave this as a text format. I'm not going to store this as an integer or even a US phone number. We don't actually need to reference any of those types today. So a text type is going to be perfect for what we need to create. Then below this input field, we're going to allow a clinic owner to select what type of specialties they work on within this clinic. Now, if you remember, in our database, under our option sets, we'd already created a list of specialties that they could select from. And this is the power of option sets. So when someone creates a new clinic, they can only select from options that we've added onto this list. And within my tutorial today, I'm going to allow a clinic to select from multiple options. So if we were to jump into our design tab, what we're going to do is just make a copy of our text element. And we're just going to update this to display the words clinic specialties. And I can just see I have a small typo there that I'm going to fix. But when it comes to the input field that's going to allow a user to select multiple specialties, by default, we actually don't really have anything suitable within our input forms menu. So we have a drop-down menu, but with a drop-down menu, that only allows a user to select from one option. Whereas as I mentioned, I want clinic owners to be able to select from multiple options. So what we need to do is install a free plugin built by Bubble, which is going to allow us to do just that. So if we jump to our plugins tab, I'm going to open up my plugin library and we're just going to type in the word multi. And we're going to install this multi-select drop-down field, which is free and built by Bubble. Once we install that, we're then going to close our plugin library, jump back to our design tab. And if I was to scroll on down and just move my head out of the way here, you'll now see under your input forms, you can select a multi drop-down. So we're going to add that onto my group here. And the very first thing we're going to do is just update the name of this to be called multi drop-down specialties. And then when it comes to the configurations under the appearance tab, this is still going to look much the same as when you set up a drop-down menu. However, the only difference is that a user, as I mentioned before, can select multiple options from this list. So because our list of specialties already exists in our database, we're going to update the choices style here to be a list of dynamic choices. Then from here, we're going to need to identify what list of choices someone can select from. And this is going to be our specialties under our option sets. Then we'll need to define of that list of specialties, which ones can someone actually select from. And that's super simple. It's just going to be all of the options. So all specialties. And then finally for the caption, so that is the text that's displayed for each option. it's just going to be the current option. So the specialties, it's display text. That is super straightforward. We're then going to jump to our layout tab. We're going to move this to the next position within our group. So that way it sits below our text heading. And of course, we're going to need to make this element fully responsive. So we will unselect that this should be a fixed width. We'll set the minimum width to be 0. And once again, set the maximum width to be 500. So that way it sits perfectly in line with all of our existing input fields. Something I might just like to do though is just update the minimum height here to be 48 pixels. So that way it's the exact same height as our existing input fields. But I'm then also just going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and then 20 pixels of margin on the right. Now below this input field, there is just one last input field we need to add in, and that is just going to be the summary or description or the bio for this clinic. So what we're going to do is make a copy of our text heading. I'm going to jump to my appearance tab, and this is going to now display the words clinic description. I'm then going to need to add an input field below this, but I'm not just going to add a standard input field. Instead, I'm going to add what's known as a multi-line input field. Now, as the name would suggest, a multi-line input field allows you to add in multiple lines of text. And look, this is perfect for long form text like text summaries or descriptions, which we're going to do right now. And essentially, if someone starts typing in this input field and they add more than one line of text, this input field is just going to continually expand down and fit all of that text within it. So when it comes to this input field, the first thing we will do is just update the name of this. I'm going to call this multi-line input clinic description. Then from here, we can jump over to our layout tab, move this to the next position within my group. And of course, we'll need to make this fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0. Only in this instance, I'm going to set the maximum width to be 800, not 500. And the reason for that is because I just want to prompt to the clinic owner that within this field, they can add quite a bit of text that they need. So it's going to stick out a little bit further. I'm also going to set the minimum height here to be 48 pixels. So that way it's the exact same minimum height as the previous input fields that sit above it. However, one thing you will notice is that at this point in time, there's no maximum height on this input field. It's currently set as infinite, and that's exactly how we want to leave it. When it has an infinite maximum height, that means that as more text is added into this input field, it will just continually expand down and display all of that. So this is the benefit to using a multi-line input field. Finally, I'll just add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 on the right. And because that was the very last input field we needed to add inside of this group, I'm then going to add a button below this, which when clicked will allow us to create a new clinic. So if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I'm going to grab a button here. I'm going to add this into my group, and this button is just going to display the word create. I'll then jump to my layout tab, move this to the next position. And look, when it comes to this button, I'm quite happy to leave it as the default settings here. The only thing I would just like to change though is the margin around it. So I'm going to add 30 pixels of margin at the top. Because this is the very last element we'll add into our group, I'm also going to add 30 pixels of margin on the bottom. And then finally 20 on the left and 20 on the right here. Now, when this button is clicked, what I'd like to do is build out a workflow that's going to create a new clinic in our database. So if we jump to our appearance tab, I'm going to choose to add a new workflow whenever this is clicked. And this is where all of the magic's going to happen. Inside this workflow, we're going to add quite a few steps here. And the very first step is that we're going to need to create a new clinic in our database. So if we head to our data tab here, we're going to choose to create a new thing. And that type of thing, as I just mentioned, is a new clinic. Then from here, we're going to need to match all of the data fields in our database with all of the relevant input fields on our page. So I'm going to select to add in all of the fields, and then we're just going to need to match these. So for the address, this is going to be the value of our search box address. For the description, this is going to be the value of our multi-line input clinic description. For the doctor, so this is the doctor related to this clinic. This is actually going to be the current user. So that is the person who is currently logged in and is creating a new clinic. For the name of this clinic, this will be the input clinic name. For the phone number, this will be the input clinic phone number. And look, I apologize if I'm speeding through these, but it is truly just a case of matching all of the input fields on our page. It's super straightforward. For our specialties, what we're going to do is add a list of all of the options that were selected from our multi-line dropdown. So what we're going to do is type in the word multi and reference our multi dropdown specialties, its value. For the unavailable dates, we actually don't need to reference this right now. That's a feature we're going to build out later on throughout our tutorial. So I'm just going to delete this. For the website, this is just going to be the value of the input clinic website. And just like that, we would have created a new clinic within our database. But at this point in time, we're going to need to add an additional step in our workflow because I'd like to make changes to the person who has just created this clinic. So if I add an additional step here, I'm going to head to my data tab and I'm not going to create a new thing, but instead I'm going to make changes to an existing thing in my database. And the thing I'd like to change is going to be the current user. So once again, that is the person who is currently logged in and has just created a new clinic. Now there's two fields I'd like to update. If someone's just created a clinic, that means that they should go from being a patient to now be a doctor. So if we scroll on down to our option sets, we can now reference a doctor. And that is all we'll need to change. Then from here, I'd also like to update their owned clinic field. So this is the clinic that's going to be attached to their profile. And I'd like this to be set as the result of step 1. So that is the clinic we created within the first step of our workflow. Now look, that's all we're going to build out in this workflow for now. However, we are going to come back and add one additional step in a moment. But before we get there, we just need to build out the rest of our page. But even before I jump back to my design tab, what I'm going to do is just color code this workflow. So I'm going to click on this and just update the workflow to be something like blue, just so I know that this workflow is related to the process of creating a new clinic. Now from here, if we jump back to our design tab, what I'd like to do is just quickly update the remaining layout settings for our first group here. So if I select on my white group, so my group step 1, I'm just going to quickly jump to my layout tab. And the first thing I'd like to do is set its minimum height to be 0. So that way it ensures that it's collapsed around all of the elements inside of it. And then finally, I'm also going to add in 20 pixels of margin around the top, the left, and the right for this group. So that way it doesn't touch the borders of my page. Now, once we've finished building out this first group, what I'm actually going to do is make a copy of this. So that way it saves us from having to rebuild the entire group from scratch. So I'm going to select on this, make a copy, click on my overall page and paste in another version. And as you'll see, that'll be positioned at the bottom of my page here. Now, the first thing I'm going to do for our new group is just update the title of this. I'm going to call this group step 2. And the purpose of this group, as I'd shown you in my previous example, is that we want our clinic owners to now choose their availability. So these are the times that they're going to be available each day in order to address patients. And so when it comes to this group, we're just going to need to make a few minor tweaks to all of the elements that sit inside of it. And the first tweak is going to be with our heading here. What I'm going to do is jump to my appearance tab and just remove all of this text. And if I was to just revert back to my original bubble editor and scroll on down to my second group, you can see here that within this heading, it just says select your availability and it has a little calendar icon in front of that. So what we're going to do is copy exactly that. So in order to add that icon, I'm just going to add in a open square bracket, the letters FA, a closed square bracket, the name of the icon. And so if we wanted to source that, we could add an icon onto our page quickly, type in the word calendar, choose the icon we want. I'm going to go with this one. And I can see that the name here is just calendar. It's super straightforward. So I'm just going to delete that icon, select on my text element, type in the word calendar, and then I'm just going to need to close off my HTML formatting. So I'm going to add yet another open square bracket, a /, then the letters FA followed by a closed square bracket. And that will automatically update the formatting of this icon. Then from here, I'm going to add a space and type in the words select your availability. And that is everything we'll need to change for this text element. Now below this, as you saw within my original editor, I have a small heading followed by a repeating group. And if we just quickly open up the appearance tab, what you'll notice is that this repeating group is linked to my option set known as the time. So if I was to open up my data tab here and open my option sets, we of course have created this option set known as the time. So these are all of the time slots within our application. So these are things like 9 a.m., 9:30, 10 a.m., 10:30 a.m. Or if you wanted to make these shorter intervals or larger intervals, you could change that however you would like. But within my repeating group, what I'd like to do is essentially just display this full list here. So in order to do that, we're going to jump to our new bubble editor that we're working on. And we're just going to take the time to quickly delete all of these input fields here that we no longer need. So I'm just going to hold down Shift, click on all of these and delete those. I'm then going to select on this text element. And I'm just going to update this to display the words select times below. And of course, when we're displaying a list of things, we need to use a repeating group. So we're going to scroll on down to our containers menu and add a repeating group below this text here. Now for this repeating group, what we're going to need to do, like every other repeating group, is first of all configure the data source so Bubble knows exactly which list of items to pull and display from our database. And when it comes to the type of content for this repeating group, as you just saw, I'm going to link this to my time option set. Then for the data source, so the bit where Bubble's going to determine which times to display, it's going to be super straightforward. I'm just going to reference every single time slot, so all my times. Then from here, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows, because I don't just want to display the first 4 time slots, I want to display every single time slot. I will, however, keep the number of columns fixed at 1, because I want 1 time slot to be on each line here. And by leaving this as 1, it will allow us to do just that. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab. And when it comes to the container layout for each cell in our repeating group, I'm going to set this to be a row. And the reason for that is because inside of each cell, I'm going to add an icon followed by a text element. Now, I'm not going to add the icon inside the text element like we've done before, because I want someone to actually be able to click on that icon. So it needs to be its own individual element. But for the time being, we're going to leave this set as a row. From here though, we're going to scroll on down to our width settings and we're going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. To make this fully responsive, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, but we don't need all of this empty space here. So I'm just going to set the maximum width to be something like 300. We'll also come back and update the height and the margins, but before I do that, I'd just like to add both of my elements inside of this repeating group. So if we scroll on up, as I mentioned, the very first thing I'm going to add is an icon element. So I'm going to grab an icon, add it into my repeating group, and I'm just going to search for a circle icon. And I'm just going to grab this empty circle here. Now for the color of this icon, I'm just going to set this to be the same shade of yellow I've used on my button here. So if you'd like that, it's FEE5A. Then once we've updated the color of this icon, I'm going to jump to my layout tab, and I'm also going to update the dimensions of this icon. So right now it's fixed at 30 pixels by 30 pixels. Whereas what I'm going to do is set this to be 40 pixels by 40 pixels. So that way it is slightly larger. I'm also going to vertically align this in the center of our repeating group before I then add in 10 pixels of margin around the top, the bottom, and the left, but I'm not going to add any margin on the right. Then beside this icon, I'm going to add in a text element, which will just display the time slot that someone can choose from. So under our visual elements, I'm going to grab a text element here. I'll add that next to my icon. And in order to reference the time, so 9 a.m., 9:30, 10 a.m., and so on, I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I can easily just reference the current cell's time, its display text. So the display text was the actual name of the time within our option set. Now, of course, from here, what I'd love to do is make this fully responsive. So if we jump to our layout tab, we can unselect that this should be a fixed width, set the minimum width to 0. I'm going to leave the maximum width as infinite. It can take up whatever space it needs within my repeating group. I'll set the minimum height to be 0. I will also vertically align this in the center of my repeating group cell. And then finally, when it comes to the margins, I'm just going to set 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom. I'll add 5 on the left. I don't need too much space between these two elements, but then also 10 on the right. And that is everything I'll need to add into this repeating group. So I'm going to select on the repeating group itself, jump to my layout tab, and I can now update the minimum height of each row to be 0. While we're here, we're also going to update the margins around this repeating group to be 20 on the left and 20 on the right. But as you'll see, there's still quite a bit of empty space being displayed around my text. And the reason for that is because if I jump to my appearance tab, although when we unselected that this should be a fixed number of rows, by default, Bubble had then set the minimum height of each row to be 100 pixels. Whereas if I was to now set this to be 0, it would collapse perfectly around all of the elements inside of it. Now, when it comes to this repeating group, I should just quickly point out some options that you might have. And now, realistically, this is probably going to confuse you more than it's going to help you, but I just want to give you the option here. So if I was to quickly just preview this page, what you'll see is that when I scroll on down, you're going to see a very long list of all of my options here. And if a user's on something like a mobile device, that's quite a few things they're going to need to scroll through, and it's going to make our page look incredibly long. So between the distance of viewing that they should select their availability right down to the button, they're going to have to scroll quite a bit. And it's not so much the scrolling that's bad, it's more that just this repeating group takes up a lot of height on our page. So if you didn't just want to display all of your time slots at once, so a list of every single option, what you could do is actually restrict how many options are displayed at once. But instead of just displaying only those options, you could allow someone to scroll within that one area. And so a way in which you could do that is by jumping back into your bubble editor, and on your repeating group, if you jump to your layout tab, what you could do is set a minimum height for your repeating group. So if I was to set this to be something like 400 pixels, and then also set a maximum height of 400 pixels, so realistically, you could select that this should be a fixed height because it's always going to be 400 pixels. What you'll find is that if I was to jump back to my preview here and refresh my page, what you'll see is that our repeating group doesn't take up as much space on our page. And although it cuts off our times here, what I can actually do is scroll within this repeating group. And so in my opinion, this just creates a much better user experience. So this is the option I'm personally going to go with, but you do have the option between both choices. So feel free to pick whichever one's going to work best for you. What I'm more interested in doing right now though is just creating the feature that allows a doctor or a clinic to actually mark this time as an available time slot. So if you remember, in our bubble editor, if we open up our data tab, we have a data type known as our time slot. And within this, we're storing a few little bits of information. So for each time slot that's created, we're going to link this back to an original clinic. So this is the clinic that notified that yes, we are available for appointments at this particular time each day. Then we're also storing in this the timestamp. So as you can see, this field is linked to our option set list, which of course stores the actual time itself. So what I'd like to do within my design tab is create an experience that when someone clicks on this little circle icon, we're going to run a workflow and we're going to create a new available time slot for that specific clinic. And then when that time slot has been created for this clinic, we're going to update this icon to display a little circle with a tick in it. So that way the clinic owner can know that yes, this time slot has been allocated. So what I'm going to do is select on this icon and I'm going to choose to add a new workflow whenever this is clicked. And inside this workflow, it's a fairly straightforward process. I'm just going to head to my data tab because I'd like to create a new thing. The type of thing I'd like to create is of course a time slot. And then I'm just going to need to match all of the data fields in my database with the relevant information from my page. So for the original clinic, what I'm going to do is reference the clinic that we have just created in our separate workflow. So if you remember, when we created a clinic, we then also made changes to a user. So that way the current user, so the person who just logged in and created a clinic, had that clinic stored under their owned clinic field. So this is the clinic that they own and operate. So what we can easily do is within our new workflow, for the original clinic that this time slot should be allocated to, this is just going to reference the current user, their owned clinic. Because of course, at this point in time, they would have created their first clinic. Then from here, I'm just going to quickly jump over this session number for now, but I will come back to it. But I just want to quickly focus on the time. So for the time here, I'm going to reference the current cell's time, and that's then going to reference the time slot from my option set. And then finally for the session number, all I need to do is reference the current cell's time. And at this point, we aren't able to reference the session number because we haven't yet created it within our option set list. So I just want to quickly digress and explain, first of all, why we're creating a session number and how we can create it. So if I just quickly jump to my data tab once again and open up my option sets and select my time list here. Inside of this list of options, we've already taken the time to write down each individual time slot. But if I'd ever like to sort these time slots in chronological order, so from earliest to last, what I could do is actually choose to create another attribute and allocate a session number to each of these time slots. So our 9 a.m. slot would be session number 1, our 9:30 time slot would be session number 2, 10 a.m. would be 3, and so on. So that's just a numerical value that just determines in which order this time slot should sit. So what I'm going to do is actually create a new attribute under our option set list here. And when it comes to this attribute, I'm just going to call this session number. And for the attribute type, this will be a number, so a numerical value. And look, by setting this as a numerical value, later on throughout our tutorial, when we actually go to filter and display a list of times, we can easily sort these by which number is the greatest or which number is the lowest. So that's why I'm using a number here, not just a text field. So I'm going to choose to create this. Then we'll just need to modify the attributes for all of our time slots. So for the 9 a.m. slot, I'm going to select to modify its attribute. And for this session number, I'm just going to have this as 1. I'll choose to save that. For 9:30, this will be session 2. For 10 a.m., this will be session 3. 10:30, this will be session 4. Then for 11, this is going to be session 5. And look, I'm not going to bore you by making you watch me do this for every single time slot, but I'd recommend just pausing this tutorial here and modifying the attribute for each individual time slot. And depending on how many times you've added, you might go up to 20 sessions, but you just need to make sure you mark these accordingly. But once you've finished adding in all your session numbers, we can jump back to our workflow tab here and set that the session number should be the current cell's time, its session number. So that's going to be formatted as a number because of course the field in our database under our data type here is also set as a number. Now what I'm going to do from here is jump back to my design tab because as I mentioned, what I'd like to do is update this icon that's displayed whenever a time slot already exists for a clinic. So let's say you've just created your own clinic, you come down to this section of our page, you click this icon and we create a new time slot for your clinic. What I want to do is update this icon to reflect that change so that way you can see that you have listed that you are in fact available for appointments at that time. So what we're going to do is head to our conditional tab on our icon here and we're going to define a condition. And within this condition, we're just going to perform a search in our database for all of the appointments that are linked back to your clinic. And within our database, if your clinic has an appointment at this specific time, what I want to do is update this icon. So to achieve this, I'm going to perform a search in my database for all of the time slots. And what I'd first like to recognize is all of the time slots where the original clinic, so the clinic that this time slot is attached to, where that equals the same value as the current user, the clinic that they own. Which of course, by this point in time, after someone creates a clinic, they would in fact own a clinic. And then I'm also going to reference the time slot where at the same time here, the time slot itself equals the same value as the current cell's time. So that is the time that someone has just selected within our repeating group. And then after we perform this search, we're just going to recognize if the count of items returned from that search. So that means that if there is a time slot where the original clinic is the current user's clinic and the time is that specific time slot we just selected, the count should be 1. So what I'm going to do is recognize when the count is greater than, and I'm going to type in the number 0. So that means that at least one time slot belongs to this clinic in our database. What I'd like to do is update this icon, and I'm going to search for a circle icon, but I'm now going to display this icon with a tick in it. And if I choose to toggle this on and off, this is what this is going to look like. And just like that, that is how we can create a new time slot within our database. But let's say a doctor comes to this page, they create a new clinic, and they've accidentally clicked on a wrong time slot. Or perhaps they've changed their mind and they don't want to offer appointments at a specific point in time. What they should be able to do is click on this icon once again, and instead of creating a new time slot, we should actually be able to delete that existing time slot that has previously been created. So what we're going to do is build out a workflow that does just that. So if we jump to our workflow tab, we're going to create a brand new workflow from scratch. And within this workflow, we're going to use the same trigger as our previous workflow. So if we head to our element actions, we're going to choose to run a workflow whenever an element is clicked. And that element is going to be our icon circle. And now within this workflow, if we head to our data tab, we're not going to create a new thing as I mentioned. Instead, we're going to delete an existing thing. And the thing I would like to delete is this particular time slot that has been created. So once again, that is the time slot where the original clinic matches the current user's clinic, and where the time equals the same value that someone's selecting from our repeating group. So what I'm going to do is with the thing I'm deleting here, I'm going to perform a search in my database for the time slot where the original clinic, once again, equals the same value as the current user, their owned clinic, and where the time equals the same value as the current cell's time. And theoretically in our database, there should only be one time slot that belongs to this clinic at this particular time. So the thing I'd like to delete is going to be the very first and only item that matches this search here. And that is how you can build out the workflow step that's going to delete a time slot. But at this point, there is another important thing I should point out. Right now, both of these workflows have the exact same trigger. So if you were to click on this icon, it would first of all create a new time slot, And then right away at the same time, it's also going to run this workflow that's going to delete that time slot. So right now these workflows just cancel each other out. So in order to avoid that, what we could do is create a condition on each of these workflows. And within that condition, we could just recognize that, first of all, if a time slot doesn't exist for this doctor at this timestamp, what we could do is create a new time slot. And then in our second workflow where we delete a time slot, we could just recognize that we only want this to run whenever a time slot does exist for this clinic. So what I'm going to do is select on my very first workflow. So this is the workflow where we're creating a time slot. Now, if I click on the workflow trigger here, so the reference to when the circle icon is clicked, what I'm going to do is add a condition onto this workflow. And I'm going to perform a search in my database and only allow this workflow here to run when a time slot in our database, where once again, the original clinic equals the same value as the current user, their owned clinic, and where at the same time, the timestamp equals the same value as the current cell's time. And if the count of all of these time slots is currently 0, meaning there is not an existing time slot for this clinic at this time, I'm going to allow this workflow to run and it will create that new time slot. So when the count here is in fact, and I'm going to type in the number 0. And as I mentioned, this workflow is going to run and it will create that new time slot. Now, because in this workflow, we are creating a new time slot, what I'm going to do is update the event color here to be green. Whereas in my second workflow, we're now going to recreate the exact same condition. So on the workflow trigger itself here, I'm going to once again perform a search in my database for all of the time slots where the original clinic equals the current user, their clinic that they own, and where the time itself equals the current cell's time. Only in this case, I'm going to recognize when the count of this search here is in fact greater than 0, meaning that there is at least one time slot in our database for this particular time with this particular clinic. What we're going to do is run this workflow and be able to then delete that. Now, because in this workflow, we are deleting a time slot, what I'm going to do is click on my workflow trigger and update the event color here to be red, just so that way I can easily differentiate between both of these workflows here. And look, that is all we need to build out for both of these workflows. If we just jump back to our design tab though, what I'd like to do is just create a workflow whenever this last button is clicked within our page. And now this button's actually not going to do much other than redirect someone back through to our home page. And so what I'm going to do is jump to my appearance tab and just update the text in this to display the word save. Then if I choose to add a workflow, I'm just going to head to our navigation events. I'm going to choose the go to page action and I'll send someone back through to our index page. So that way, once they finish the process of creating a new clinic and also selecting their times, it's just going to redirect them back to our home page. Now that is almost everything we need to build out on this page and this whole experience. There is just one last thing I need to walk you through. And just when you thought I'd already confused you enough when it came to selecting times, I'm going to throw another curveball in the mix. So at this point in time, both of these groups are of course being displayed on my page right now. Whereas as I mentioned at the start of this tutorial, I only want one group to be displayed at a time. So what I need to do is create some sort of way to know when to hide and display each of these relevant groups. Now look, in Bubble, there's certainly several different ways that you can do this, but the way I'm going to show you today is by leveraging what's known as a custom state. And right now you're probably thinking, Lachlan, what on earth is custom state? And that is a very valid question. A custom state in Bubble is a way to just temporarily store data and information in your page, not in your database. And so the way I'm going to use a custom state today is I'm just going to recognize, hey, on my page at any given point in time, should I be displaying group number 1 or should I be displaying group number 2? And the reason why I'm storing this information as a custom state is because I don't really need to store this information in my database. It's just going to take up a lot of unnecessary space. And I don't permanently need that information stored as a record in my database. I'm quite happy to just store it on my page. Now, the thing about custom states is that when you refresh the page, it will refresh the value of your custom state. So let's say I've displayed group number 2 here, and if I refresh the page, it would revert back to displaying group number 1. So that is the downside to a custom state. But in our use case today, that is the exact experience we want to occur. So in order to create a custom state, we're just going to double click on our overall page. So this is our manage element. And if you just jump on over in your property editor to click this little information icon here, it's going to open up this little backdoor menu, which in my opinion is like the wardrobe to Narnia. Bubble does a great job of hiding this, even though it is an extremely powerful feature. So within this element inspector, you're going to see the option to add a new custom state. And when you click on this, it's going to look like the process of creating a new data field. And that's because you essentially are. Remember how I mentioned that states can store information and data on your page? This is where you can identify what that data is going to be. So for the state name here, I'm just going to call this display group 1. And for the state type, I'm going to scroll on down and select that this should be a yes/no value, because I either do want to display group number 1 or I don't want to display group number 1. So I'm going to choose to create this here. And then what I'm also going to do is set the default value here to be yes. So by default, I would like to display group number 1. I'm then going to need to create another custom state. Only this time I'll be calling it display group 2. And once again, the state type here will be a yes/no option. And once I create this, I'm actually going to set the default value here to be no, because once this page is loaded, I don't want to display group number 2 by default. It's only when someone clicks this button to create a new clinic that I'd like to hide this group and then display our second group. So what I'm going to do is select on my create button here. I'm going to choose to edit the existing workflow. And at the very last step of our workflow, what I'm going to do is update the value of our custom state. So instead of displaying group number 1 by default, I'm going to display group number 2. So what I'm going to do is type in the word state, and I'm going to choose to set the state of an element. The element will be our manage page, and the custom state will first of all be our display group number 1 state. I'm going to set its value to now equal no, because once again, by default, it was set to yes. I'm then going to set another state on our manage page, and that of course will be our display group 2. And in this case, I'm going to set this value to now equal yes, because I do want to display group number 2. So that is literally everything we need to do when it comes to building out this workflow. We do, however, just quickly need to jump back to our design tab and update some conditions on both of our groups. So what we need to do is make both of these groups invisible, and then create a condition that just recognizes when, first of all, the display group number 1 state is set to yes, I should display my first group. And then when the display group number 2 state is yes, I should display my second group. So we're going to start by selecting on our first group here. So our group step number 1. And if we jump to our layout tab, we're going to unselect this option to make this element visible on page load. I'm also going to tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden. So that way it doesn't take up any empty space on our page when it's not being shown. I'm then going to jump to my conditional tab. I'm going to define a new condition, and I'm going to recognize when the custom state in my page. So I'm going to type in the word manage and reference my manage page. And if I scroll on down, you'll see a list of all of our custom states, which are storing information in our page. So when the display group number 1 state is yes, what I'd like to do is say that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. So now this means that it's going to display this group. I'm then going to scroll on down to my second group. So group step number 2. I'll do the exact same thing. So if I jump to my layout tab, I will unselect that this element should be visible on page load. Then I'll also tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden. And then from here, I'll jump to my conditional tab. I'll define a condition, and I'll just recognize when my manage page, when the display group 2 custom state is in fact yes, what I'd like to do is select that this element should be visible and now tick that that should be true. And look, after building that out, that is the very last thing we need to create within this whole experience today. So what I'd love to do is just run a quick demo of how this whole feature is going to look. So that way you can see all of our hard work come to life. Over in a preview of my application, I'm currently logged in as my Lachlan Kirkwood account, and I'm going to create my first clinic here. So for my clinic name, I'm just going to call this test clinic. For the address, I'm going to set this as a real world address. So I'm just going to choose this address here in San Francisco. For the clinic website, I'm just going to say that this is www.testclinic.com. For the phone number, I'll just add in a random string of numbers here. And for my specialties, let's say I'm a dermatologist, somehow I'm a dentist, and miraculously, I am also a psychiatrist. So if you got problems, I'm your guy here, and I'm happy to listen. Now for the clinic description, I'm just going to quickly jump into the lorem ipsum generator, so that way I could just copy across some dummy text. If you also want to copy this across, I'd recommend just Google searching lorem ipsum, and then you can just grab some dummy text here, or you could use a tool like ChatGPT or something. But for me, I'm just going to copy this across, add this in, and something I should also just point out is that as you can see on our page, we only have access to view group number 1 here. We can't see group number 2, and that is because with our custom state, it of course is displaying group number 1 by default. When I click this button here, it's going to run our workflow. It's going to then create a new clinic in our database. It's going to update our account, so we are now a doctor, and then it's going to update the custom state. So it's now going to display group number 2. Then from here, I can choose to mark all of the available times that I'm happy to see clients in my clinic. So I'm going to go ahead and say I'm available at 9 a.m., 9:30, 10 a.m., 10:30, 11, and so on. But then I changed my mind. Look, your boy here enjoys his beauty sleep, and let's say 9 a.m. is too early for me. I only want to get into the clinic at 10 a.m. So what I'm going to do is actually unselect both the 9 a.m. and the 9:30 a.m. time slots, and that's now going to delete those out of our database. So right now, I'm only available for appointments at these few time slots. And then after I've selected those, I'm quite happy to move on. So I'm going to click this save button. And what that's going to do is just redirect me back through to my homepage. And just like that, you now know exactly how to create and list your own clinic within our Zocdoc clone. Just quickly jumping back into my Notion checklist, we're going to tick off that we finished building out the feature to list a new practice. And look, as I mentioned at the start of this module, there was quite a bit that we needed to work through. Within this, we learned a lot about things like custom states, conditions, repeating groups, addresses. There was so much that I needed to cover. But look, thankfully, it wasn't anything that we couldn't handle using Bubble's no-code tool. And just like that, that is all I have time to include within this tutorial today. As you can see, we've been building for literally hours, and there's still so many features that I need to cover in as much detail as possible. Now, if you wanted to finish building out your entire Zocdoc clone, I'd recommend getting access to the full course through the link in the description of this video. Now, while this full course is going to cost you money, I'm confident that it's going to save you months of your life having to learn how to rebuild each of these features from scratch. So if you're looking to build and launch your startup as quickly as possible, I definitely recommend checking that out. Within that full course, we still need to build out a whole suite of additional features. So things like allowing doctors to actually edit the details of their existing clinic, building out a custom search feature as well as a search results page, creating the actual appointment scheduling feature itself, which is arguably one of the most important features within Zocdoc. We also need to build out a page where doctors can manage a list of all of their upcoming appointments, create a page where our patients can view a list of all of their appointments, as well as build out a user reviews feature so that way patients can leave reviews for each of the clinics that they visit. So as you can see, there is still so much that we need to cover. In the meantime, if you were interested in staying up to date with any additional Bubble resources I share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button on my channel so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new video. For now though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.